Okay, whatever. So I think I start with cooldowns again, I guess, first. Yeah, let's start with the cooldowns. Already know. Okay. Already know. Do I have it? Already forgot. Do I have an other enchanter? The warlock. And other Taylor? No. It can be sold.
What brings you here? May the stars guide you.
So I got 7 now. Do I have access to the headband? Close headband. One moment, please. Let's make this. Why not? I mean, I need 5. Oh. I only have the lower version. Maybe I... No. I enchanted
I'm listening.
at least with one of these.
Good luck, friend.
Not a valid target? What? Oh, because it's a head. Okay, That makes sense. So it is green now on the Warlock side. By the way, it doesn't matter. So that was Paladin don't need, Rogue don't need, no. Rogue need to make a cooldown. And it looks like he's on the collection of things. By the way, why is no here? No turtle here. Reading nothing up? What is this? My mining is on. Why I don't see it? Am I blind? It's not possible that so many rains are not up. Oh, I think I can slowly start with the audiobook. But this time I have to check the volume. Last time it was very low and I only recognize it after I stopped. So 36 was the last chapter.
I carefully re-rolled the piece of paper and tucked it back into the hollow piece of horn. My mind spun with what I had just learned. I thought of what I'd heard Haliac say to Cinder all those years ago. Who keeps you safe from the Amir? The singers, the scythe. After my months of searching, I was fairly certain the archives held nothing more than fairy stories about the Chandrian. Nobody considered them more real than shamblemen or fairies. But everyone knew about the Amir. They were the bright knights of the Aturan Empire. They were the strong hand of the church for 200 years. They were the subject of 100 stories and songs.
Let's run, enjoy, and
I knew
hopefully
my
now
history.
it's loud enough.
The Amir had been founded by the Talian Church in the early days of the Aturan Empire. But the pottery Nina had seen had been much older than that. I knew my history. The Amir had been condemned and disbanded by the church before the empire fell. But I knew the Chandrian was still afraid of them today. It seemed like there was more to the story. Chapter 36. All this knowing. Days passed, and I invited Will and Sim across the river to celebrate our successful campaign against Ambrose. Given my taste for Soulstone, I was not much of a drinker, but Will and Sim were kind enough to demonstrate the fine points of the art. We visited several different taverns, just for variety, but eventually we ended up back at the Aeolian. I preferred it because of the music, Simon because of the women, and Willem because it served scutton. I was moderately well buttered when I was called up onto the stage, but it takes more than a little drink to make me fumble-fingered. Just to prove I was not drunk, I made my way through Whither with He with the Withy, a song that's difficult enough to articulate when sober as a stone. The audience loved it and showed its appreciation in the appropriate way, and since I was not drinking Soonton that night, much of the evening is lost to living memory. The three of us walked the long road back from the Aeolian. There was a crispness to the air that spoke of winter, but the three of us were young and warmed from the inside by many drinks. A breeze pushed my cloak back, and I took a full, happy breath. Then a sudden panic seized me. "Where's my loot?" I asked more loudly than I'd intended. "You left it with stanchion at the Aeolian," Willem said. "He was afraid you would trip over it and break your neck." Simon had stopped in the middle of the road. I bumped into him, lost my balance, and tumbled to the ground. He hardly seemed to notice. "Well," he said seriously, "I certainly don't feel up to that right now." Stonebridge rose ahead of us, 200 feet from end to end, with a high arch that peaked 5 stories above the river. It was part of the great stone road, straight as a nail, flat as a table, and older than God. I knew it weighed more than a mountain. I knew it had a 3-foot parapet running along both its edges. Despite all this knowing, I felt deeply uneasy at the thought of trying to cross it. I climbed unsteadily to my feet. As the three of us examined the bridge, Willem began to lean slowly to one side. I reached out to steady him, and at the same time Simon laid hold of my arm, though whether to help me or to brace himself, I couldn't be certain. "I certainly don't feel up to that right now," Simon repeated. "There's a place to sit over here," Willem said. "Trelli Turin Avorka." Simon and I muffled our laughter, and Willem led us through the trees to a little clearing not 50 feet from the foot of the bridge. To my surprise, a tall grey stone stood in the middle of it, pointing skyward. Will entered the clearing with calm familiarity. I came more slowly, looking about curiously. Greystones are special to troopers, and seeing it gave rise to mixed feelings. Simon flopped down in the thick grass, while Willem settled his back against the trunk of a leaning birch. I moved to the greystone and touched it with my fingertips. It was warm and familiar. "Don't push at that thing," Simon said nervously. "You'll tip it over." I laughed. "This stone has been here for 1,000 years, Sim. I don't think my breathing on it is going to hurt it. Just come away from it. They're not good things." "It's a greystone," I said, giving it a friendly pat. "They mark old roads. If anything, we're safer being next to it. Greystones mark safe places. Everyone knows that." Sim shook his head stubbornly. "They're pagan relics." "A jot says I'm right," I taunted. "Ha!" Still on his back, Sim held up a hand. I stepped over to slap it, formalizing our wager. "We can go to the archives and settle it tomorrow," Sim said. I sat down next to the greystone and had just started to relax when I was seized by a sudden panic. "Body of God!" I said. "My loot!" I tried to jump to my feet and failed, almost managing to knock out my brains against the greystone in the process. Simon tried to sit up and calm me, but the sudden motion was too much for him, and he fell awkwardly onto his side and began to laugh helplessly. "This isn't funny!" I shouted. "It's at the Aeolian," Willem said. "You've asked about it 4 times since we left." "No, I haven't," I said with more conviction than I really felt. I rubbed my head where I'd knocked it against the greystone. "There is no reason to be ashamed," Willem waved a hand dismissively. "It is man's nature to dwell on what sits close to his heart. I heard Kilvin got a few in him at the taps a couple of months ago and wouldn't shut up about his new coal sulphur lamp," Simon said. Will snorted. "Lauren would rattle on about proper Sylvan behaviour. Grasp by the spine, grasp by the spine. Oh!" He growled and made clutching motions with both hands. If I hear him say it again, I will grasp his spine. A flash of memory came to me. Merciful Taylor, I said, suddenly aghast. Did I sing Tinker Tailor at the Aeolian tonight? You did, Simon said. I didn't know it had so many verses. I wrinkled my forehead, trying desperately to remember. Did I sing the verse about the Tillin and the sheep? It was not a good verse for polite company. Yeah, Willem said. Oh, thank God, I said. It was a goat. Willem managed seriously before he bubbled up into laughter. In the Tailins cassock, Simon sang, then joined Willem in laughter. No, I said miserably, resting my head in my hands. My mother used to make my dad sleep under the wagon when he sang that in public. Oh, Stanchion will beat me with a stick and take away my pipes next time I see him. They loved it, Simon reassured me. I saw Stanchion singing along, Willem added. His nose was a little red by that time too. There was a long piece of comfortable quiet. Truth? Simon asked. Yes? Are you really a Damaroo? The question caught me unprepared. Normally it would have set me on edge, but at the moment I didn't know how I felt about it. Does it matter? No, I was just wondering. Oh. I continued to watch the stars for a while. Wondering what? Nothing in particular, he said. Ambrose called you Roo a couple of times, but he's called you other insulting things before. It's not an insult, I said. I mean, he's called you things that weren't true, Sim said quickly. You don't talk about your family, but you've said things that made me wonder. He shrugged, still flat on his back, looking up at the stars. I've never known one of the Adema, not well anyway. What you hear isn't true, I said. We don't steal children or worship dark gods or anything like that. I never believed any of that, he said dismissively, then added, but some of the things they say must be true. I've never heard anyone play like you. That doesn't have anything to do with my being a Damaroo, I said, then reconsidered. Maybe a little. Do you dance? Willem asked, seemingly out of the blue. If the comment had come from anyone else, or at a different time, it probably would have started a fight. That's just how people picture us, playing pipes and fiddles, dancing around our campfires, when we aren't stealing everything that isn't nailed down, of course. A little bitterness crept into my tone when I said the last. That's not what being a Damaroo is about. What is it about? Simon asked. I thought about it for a moment, but my sodden wit wasn't up to the task. We're just people, really, I said eventually. Except we don't stay in one place very long and everyone hates it. The three of us watched the stars quietly. Did she really make him sleep under the wagon? Simon asked. What? You said your mum made your dad sleep under the wagon for singing the verse about the sheep. Did she really? It's mostly a figure of speech, I said, but once she really did. I didn't often think of my early life in my troop, back when my parents were alive. I avoided the subject the same way a cripple learns to keep the weight off an injured leg. But Sim's question brought a memory bubbling to the surface of my mind. It wasn't for singing Tinker Tanner, I found myself saying. It was a song he'd written about her. I was quiet for a long moment. Then I said it. Lorien. It was the first time I'd said my mother's name in years. The first time since she'd been killed. It felt strange in my mouth. Then, without really meaning to, I began to sing. Dark Lorien, Arleden's wife, has a face like the blade of a knife, has a voice like a prickle brown burr, but can tally a sum like a money lender. My sweet Tally cannot cook, but she keeps a tidy ledger book. For all her faults I do confess, it's worth my life to make my wife not tally a lot less. I felt oddly numb, disconnected from my own body. Strangely, while the memory was sharp, it wasn't painful. I can see how that might earn a man a place under the wagon, Willem said gravely. It wasn't that, I heard myself saying. She was beautiful and they both knew it. They used to tease each other all the time. It was the meter. She hated the awful meter. I never talked about my parents, and referring to them in the past tense felt uncomfortable. Disloyal. Will and Sim weren't surprised by my revelation. Anyone who knew me could tell I had no family. I'd never said anything, but they were good friends. They knew. In Ottawa, we sleep in the kennels when our wives are angry, Simon said, nudging the conversation back into safer territory. Steady, Willem muttered. A Churan! Simon shouted, his voice bubbling with amusement. No more of your donkey talk! Edda Stitty, I repeated. You sleep next to Fire? Willem nodded. I'm officially protesting how quickly you picked up Siaru, Sim said, holding up a finger. I studied a year before I was any good. A year! You gobbled it up in a single term! I learned a lot growing up, I said. I was just getting the fine points this term. Your accent is better, Will said to Sim. Quoth sounds like some southern trader. Very low. You sound much more refined. Sim seemed mollified by that. Next to the fire, he repeated. Does it seem odd that it's the men that always have to do their sleeping somewhere else? It's pretty obvious women control the bed, I said. Not an unpleasant thought, Sim said. Depending on the woman. Distrel is pretty, Sim said. Keh, Will said. Too pale. Failure. Simon shook his head mournfully. How's of our league? She's Modigan, Willem said, his grin so wide it was almost demonic. She is? Sim asked. Will nodded, wearing the widest smile I'd ever seen on his face. Sim sighed wretchedly. Oh, it figures. Bad enough that she's the prettiest girl in the Commonwealth. I didn't know she was Modigan too. I'll grant you prettiest girl on her side of the river, I corrected. On this side, there's... You've already gone on about your Dana, Will interrupted. 5 times. Listen, Simon said, his tone suddenly serious. You just have to make your move. This Dana girl is obviously interested in you. She hasn't said anything along those lines. They never say they're interested, Simon laughed at the absurdity of it. They are little games. It's like a dance. He held up 2 hands, making them talk to each other. Oh, fancy meeting you here. Why, hello. I was just going to lunch. Oh, what a happy coincidence. So was I. Oh, can I carry your books? I held up a hand to stop him. Can we skip to the end of this puppet show where you end up sobbing into your beer for a span of days? Simon scowled at me. Willem laughed. She has enough men fawning over her, I said. They come and go like... I strained to think of an analogy and failed. I'd rather be her friend. You would rather be close to her heart, Willem said without any particular inflection. You would rather be joyfully held in the circle of her arms, but you fear she will reject you. You fear she would laugh and you would look the fool. Willem shrugged easily. You're hardly the first to feel this way. There's no shame in it. That struck uncomfortably close to the mark, and for a long moment I couldn't think of anything to say in reply. I hope, I admitted quietly, but I don't want to assume. I've seen what happens to the men that assume too much and cling to her. Willem nodded solemnly. She brought you that loot case, Sim said helpfully. That has to mean something. But what does it mean? I said. It seems like she's interested, but what if it's just wishful thinking on my part? All those other men must think she's interested too. But they're obviously wrong. What if I'm wrong too? You'll never know unless you try, Sim said with a bitter edge to his voice. That's what I'd normally say, but you know what? It doesn't work worth a damn. I chase them and they kick at me like I'm a dog at the dinner table. I'm tired of trying so hard. He gave a weary sigh, still flat on his back. Oh, all I want is someone who likes me. All I want is a clear sign, I said. I want a magical horse that fits in my pocket, Will said, and a ring of red amber that gives me power over demons and an endless supply of cake. There was another moment of comfortable quiet. The wind brushed gently through the trees. They say the Rue know all the stories in the world, Simon said after a while. Probably true, I admitted. Tell one, he said. I eyed him narrowly. Don't look at me like that, he protested. I'm in the mood for a story, that's all. We are somewhat lacking for entertainment, Willem said. Fine, let me think. I closed my eyes, and a story with Amir in it bubbled to the surface, hardly surprising. They had been on my mind constantly since Nina had found me. I sat up straight. All right. I took a breath, then paused. If either of you have to go and piss, do it now. I don't like having to stop halfway through. Silence. Okay. I cleared my throat. There is a place not many folk have seen. A strange place called Faire. If you believe the stories, there are two things that make Faire unique. First, it is where all the roads in the world meet. Second, it is not a place any man has ever found by searching. It is not a place you travel to. It is the place you pass through while on your way to somewhere else. They say that anyone who travels long enough will come there. This is a story of that place, and of an old man on a long road, and of a long and lonely night without a moon. Chapter 37. A Piece of Fire. Faire was a great crossroads, but there was no inn where the roads met. Instead, there were clearings in the trees where travelers would set their camps and pass the night. Once, years ago and miles away, 5 groups of travelers came to Faire. They chose their clearings and lit their fires as the sun began to set, pausing on their way from here to there. Later, after the sun had set and night was settled firmly in the sky, an old beggar in a tattered robe came walking down the road. He moved with slow care, leaning on a walking stick. The old man was going from nowhere to nowhere. He had no hat for his head and no pack for his back. He had not a penny or a purse to put in it. He barely even owned his own name, and even that had been worn thin and threadbare through the years. If you'd asked him who he was, he would have said, nobody. But he would have been wrong. The old man made his way into Faire. He was hungry as a dry fire, and weary to his bones. All that kept him moving was the hope that someone might give him a bit of dinner and a piece of their fire. So when the old man saw firelight flickering, he left the road and made his weary way toward it. Soon he saw 4 tall horses through the trees. Silver was worked into their harness, and silver was mixed with the iron of their shoes. Nearby, the beggar saw a dozen mules laden with goods, woolen cloth, cunning jewelry, and fine steel blades. But what caught the beggar's attention was the side of meat above the fire, steaming and dripping fat onto the coals. He almost fainted at the sweet smell of it, for he had been walking all day with nothing to eat but a handful of acorns and a bruised apple he'd found by the side of the road. Stepping into the clearing, The old beggar called out to the 3 dark-bearded men who sat around the fire. "Hello," he said. "Can you spare a bit of meat and a piece of your fire?" They turned, their gold chains glittering in the firelight. "Certainly," their leader said. "What do you have with you? Bits or pennies, rings or strelaum, or do you have the true ringing Caeldish coin we prize above all others?" "I have none of these," the old beggar said, opening his hands to show they were empty. "Then you will find no comfort here," they said, and as he watched, they began to carve thick pieces from the haunch that hung by the fire. "No offense, Willem, it's just how the story goes." "I didn't see anything." "You looked like you were going to." "I may, but it will wait until after." The old man walked on, following the light of another fire through the trees. "Hello!" the old beggar called out as he stepped into the second clearing. He tried to sound cheerful, though he was weary and sore. "Can you spare a bit of meat and a piece of your fire?" There were 4 travelers there, 2 men and 2 women. At the sound of his voice, they rose to their feet, but none of them spoke. The old man waited politely, trying to appear pleasant and harmless. But the quiet stretched on, long, and still no word was spoken. Understandably, the old man grew irritated. He was used to being shunned or shrugged aside, but these folk merely stood. They were quiet and restless, moving from foot to foot while their hands twitched nervously. Just as he was about to sulk away, the fire flared, and the beggar saw the 4 wore the blood-red clothes that marked them as Ardem mercenaries. Then the old man understood. The Ardem are called the Silent Folk, and they speak only rarely. The old man knew many stories of the Ardem. He'd heard that they possessed a secret craft called the Lethani. This let them wear their quiet like an armor that would turn a blade or stop an arrow in the air. This is why they seldom spoke. They saved their words, keeping them inside, like coals in the belly of a furnace. Those hoarded words filled them with so much restless energy that they could never be completely still, which is why they were always twitching and fidgeting about. Then when they fought, they used their secret craft to burn those words like fuel inside themselves. This made them strong as bears and fast as snakes. When the beggar first heard these rumors, he thought them silly campfire stories. But years ago in Modeg, he had seen an Ardem woman fight the city guard. The soldiers were armed and armored, thick of arm and chest. They had demanded to see the woman's sword in the king's name, and though hesitant, he presented it to them. As soon as they held it in their hands, they had leered and pawed at her, making lewd suggestions about what she could do to get it back. They were tall men with bright armor, and their swords were sharp. They fell like autumn wheat before her. She killed 3 of them, breaking their bones with her hands. Her own wounds were minor by comparison, a dark bruise along one cheek, a slight limp, a shallow cut across one hand. Even after all the long years, the old man remembered the way she had licked the blood from the back of her hand like a cat. This is what the old beggar thought of when he saw the Ardem standing there. All thought of food and fire left him, and he backed slowly into the shelter of the surrounding trees. Then he set off toward the next fire, hoping third time would prove lucky. At this clearing were a number of Aturans standing around a dead donkey lying near a cart. One of them spotted the old man. "Look," he pointed. "Grab him! We'll hitch him to the cart and make him pull!" The old man darted back into the trees, and after running to and fro, he lost the Aturans by hiding under a pile of fallen leaves. When the sound of the Aturans faded, the old man dragged himself from the leaves and found his walking stick. Then, with the courage of one who is poor and hungry, he set off to the fourth fire he saw in the distance. There he might have found what he was looking for, because around the fire were traders from Vintas. Had things been different, they might have welcomed him to dinner, saying, "Where 6 can eat, 7 can eat." But by this point the old man was quite a sight. His hair stuck from his head in wild disarray. His robe, ragged before, was now torn and dirty. His face was pale from fright, and his breathing groaned and wheezed in his chest. Because of this, the Vints gasped and made gestures before their faces. They thought he was a barrow draug, you see, one of the unquiet dead that superstitious Vints believe walk the night. Each of the Vints had a different thought as to how they could stop him. Some thought fire would frighten him off. Some thought salt scattered on the grass would keep him away. Some thought iron would cut the strings that held the soul to his dead body. Listening to them argue, the old beggar realized that no matter what they agreed on, he would not be the better for it, so he hurried back to the sheltering trees. The old man found a rock to sit on and brushed the dead leaves and dirt away as best he could. After sitting for a while, he thought to try one final campsite, knowing it would only take one generous traveler to fill his belly. He was pleased to see a lone man sitting at the final fire. Coming closer, he saw a thing that left him both delighted and afraid. For though the beggar had lived many years, he had never before spoken to one of the Amir. Still, he knew the Amir were a part of Telu's church, and
"They weren't part of the church,"
Willem said. What? Of course they were.
"No, they were of the Aturan bureaucracy. They had the Karam, judiciary powers."
They were called the Holy Order of Amir. They were the strong right hand of the church.
Better jot.
Fine, if it'll keep you quiet through the rest of the story. The old beggar was delighted, for he knew the Amir were a part of Telu's church, and the church was sometimes generous to the poor. The Amir came to his feet as the old man approached.
"Who goes there?"
he asked. His voice was proud and powerful, but also tired.
"No, I am of the Order Amir. None should come between me and my tasks. I will act for the good of all, though gods and men might bar my way."
"Sir," the beggar said, "I'm just hoping for a piece of fire and some charity on a long road."
The Amir gestured the old man forward. He was armored in a suit of bright steel rings, and his sword was as tall as a man. His tabard was of shining white, but from the elbows the color darkened into crimson, as if dipped in blood. In the center of his chest, he wore the symbol of the Amir, the black tower wrapped in a crimson flame. The old man sat near the fire and gave a sigh as the heat soaked into his bones. After a moment, the Amir spoke.
"I am afraid I can offer you nothing to eat. My horse eats better than I do tonight, but that does not mean that he eats well."
"Anything would be a lovely help," the old man said. "Scraps are more than what I have. I am not proud."
The Amir sighed.
"Tomorrow I must ride 50 miles to stop a trial. If I fail or falter, an innocent woman will die. This is all I have."
The Amir gestured to a piece of cloth, a crust of bread, and a sliver of cheese. Both of them together would hardly be enough to dent the old man's hunger. It made a poor dinner for a man as large as the Amir.
"Tomorrow I must ride and fight," the armored man said. "I need my strength, so I must weigh your night of hunger against this woman's life."
As he spoke, the Amir raised his hands and held them palms up, like the plates of a balancing scale. When he made this motion, the old beggar saw the backs of the Amir's hands, and for a second he thought the Amir had cut himself and that blood was running between his fingers and down his arms. Then the fire shifted, and the beggar saw it was only a tattoo, though he still shivered at the bloody markings on the Amir's hands and arms. He would have done more than shiver had he known all that those markings meant. They showed the Amir was trusted so completely by the Order that his actions would never be questioned. And as the Order stood behind him, no church, no court, no king could move against him, for he was one of the Kiridai, highest of the Amir. If he killed an unarmed man, it was not murder in the Order's eyes. If he strangled a pregnant woman in the middle of the street, none would speak against him. Should he burn a church or break an old stone bridge, the Empire held him blameless, trusting all he did was in the service of the greater good. But the beggar knew none of this, and so he tried again.
If you don't have any food to spare, could I have a penny or two?
He thought of the Kael'dish camp and how he might buy a slice of meat or bread. The Amir shook his head.
If I did, I would gladly give it. But 3 days ago I gave the last of my money to a new widower with a hungry child. I have been penniless as you are ever since.
He shook his head, his expression weary and full of regret.
I wish circumstances were different, but I now must sleep. So you must go.
The old man was hardly happy about this, but there was something in the Amir's voice that made him wary. So he creaked back onto his feet and left the fire behind. Before the warmth of the Amir's fire could leave him, the old man tightened his belt and made up his mind to simply walk through till morning, hoping the end of his road might bring him better luck, or at least a meeting with some kinder folk. So he walked through the center of Ferinium, and as he did, he saw a circle of great grey stones. Inside that circle was the faint glow of firelight hidden in a well-dug pit. The old man noticed he couldn't smell a wisp of smoke either, and realized these folk were burning rennet wood, which burns hot and hard, but doesn't smoke or stink. Then the old man saw that 2 of the great shapes were not stones at all. They were wagons, a handful of people huddled round a cookpot in the dim light of the fire. But the old man didn't have a shred of hope left, so he kept walking. He was almost past the stones when a voice called out,
Oh there! Who are you? And why do you pass by so quietly at night? I'm nobody,
the old man said.
Just an old beggar following my road until its end.
Why are you out walking instead of settling down to sleep? These roads are not all safe at night, the voice replied.
I have no bed, the old man said, and tonight I cannot beg or borrow one for all the world.
There is one for you here, if you would like it, and a bit of dinner if you've a mind to share. No one should walk all day and night besides. A handsome, bearded man stepped from the concealment of the tall grey stones. He took the old man's elbow and led him toward the fire, calling ahead,
We have a guest tonight.
There was a small stir of motion ahead of them, but the night was moonless, and their fire was deep in a concealment, so the beggar couldn't see much of what was being done. Curious, he asked,
Why do you hide your fire?
His host sighed.
Not all folk are filled with love for us. We're safest by being out of harm's way. Besides, our fire is small tonight. Why is that?
The beggar asked.
With so many trees, wood should be easy to come by.
We went gathering earlier, the bearded man explained.
But folk called us thieves and shot arrows at us.
He shrugged.
So we make do, and tomorrow will take care of itself.
He shook his head.
I'm talking too much. May I offer you a drink, Father? A bit of water if you can spare it. Nonsense, you will have wine. It had been a long time since the beggar had tasted wine, and the thought of it was enough to set his mouth all a-watering. But he knew wine was not the best thing for an empty stomach that had walked all day, so he said, "You are kind, bless you, but water is good enough for me." The man at his elbow smiled. "Then have water and wine, each to your desire." And saying so, he brought the beggar to their water barrel. The old beggar bent and drew up a ladle of water. When it touched his lips, it was cool and sweet. But as he drew up the ladle, he couldn't help but notice the barrel was very nearly empty. In spite of this, his host urged him, "Take another and wash the dust from your hands and face. I can tell you've been on the road for a long and weary while." So the old beggar took a second dipper of water, and once his hands and face were clean, he felt much refreshed. Then his host took his elbow again and led him to the fire. "What is your name, Father?" Again the beggar was surprised. It had been years since anyone had cared enough to ask his name. It had been so long, he had to stop and think about it for a moment. "Skeop," he said at last. "I am called Skeop. And you?" "My name is Terrace," his host said as he made the old man comfortable close to the fire. "This is Scylla, my wife, and Wint, our son. This is Shari and Bentham and Lil and Peter and Fent." Then Terrace brought Skeop wine. Scylla gave him a heavy ladle of potato soup, a slice of warm bread, and half a golden summer squash with sweet butter in the bowl of it. It was plain, and there was not a lot, but to Skeop it seemed a feast. And as he ate, Wint kept his cup full of wine and smiled at him and sat by his knee and called him grandfather. The last was too much for the old beggar, and he began to cry softly. Perhaps it was that he was old, and his day had been a long one. Perhaps it was that he was not used to kindness. Perhaps it was the wine. Whatever the reason, tears began to trickle down his face and lose themselves in his deep white beard. Terrace saw this and was quick to ask, "Father, whatever is the matter?" "I am a silly old man," Skeop said, more to himself than to the rest of them. "You have been kinder to me than anyone in years, and I am sorry I cannot repay you." Terrace smiled and laid a hand on the old man's back. "Would you really like to pay?" "I cannot. I have nothing to give you." Terrace's smile widened. "Skeop, we are the Adema Rue. The thing we value most is something everyone possesses." One by one, Skeop saw the faces around the fire look up at him expectantly. Terrace said, "You could tell us your story." Not knowing what else to do, Skeop began to speak. He told how he had come to Ferinial, how he had walked from one fire to the next hoping for charity. At first, his voice faltered and his story stumbled, for he had been alone a long time and was not used to talking. But soon his voice became stronger, his words bolder, and as the fire flickered and reflected in his bright blue eyes, his hands danced along with his old dried voice. Even the Adema Rue, who know all the stories in the world, could do nothing but listen in wonder. When his story came to an end, the troopers stirred as if waking from a deep sleep. For a moment, they did nothing but look at each other. Then they looked at Skeop. Terrace knew what they were thinking. "Skeop," he asked gently, "where were you headed when I stopped you tonight?" "I was going to Tinue," said Skeop, who was a little embarrassed at how caught up in the story he had become. His face was hot and red, and he felt foolish. "We're bound for Belenay ourselves," Terrace said. "Would you consider coming with us instead?" For a moment, Skeop's face lit with hope, but then it fell. "I would be nothing but a burden. Even a beggar has his pride." Terrace laughed. You would tell the Damer about pride? We do not ask you out of pity. We ask because you belong in our family, and we would have you tell us a dozen stories in the years to come. The beggar shook his head. My blood is not yours. I am not part of your family. What does that have to do with the price of butter? Terrace asked. We Rue decide who is a part of our family and who is not. You belong with us. Look around and see if I am lying. Skeop looked up at the circle of faces and saw what Terrace said was true. And so the old man stayed and lived with them for many years before they parted ways. Many things he saw and many stories he told, and everyone was wiser in the end because of it. This thing happened, though it was years and miles away. I have heard it from the mouths of the Ademaru, and thus I know it to be true. Chapter 38. Kernels of Truth. Is that the end? Simon asked after a polite pause. He was on his back, looking up at the stars. Yes. It didn't end the way I thought it would, he said. What did you expect? I was waiting to find out who the beggar really was. I thought as soon as someone was nice to him, he would turn out to be Tabor in the Great. Then he would give them his walking stick and a sack of money and, I don't know, make something magical happen. Willem spoke up. He'd say, whenever you are in danger, knock this stick on the ground and say, stick, be quick, and then the stick would whirl around and defend them from whoever was attacking them. Willem was lying on his back in the tall grass too. I didn't think he was really an old beggar. Old beggars in stories are never really old beggars, Simon said with a hint of accusation in his voice. They're always a witch or a prince or an angel or something. In real life, old beggars are almost always old beggars, I pointed out. But I know what kind of story you two are thinking about. Those are stories we tell other people to entertain them. This story is different. It's one we tell each other. Why tell a story if it's not entertaining? To help us remember. To teach us, I made a vague gesture, things. Like exaggerated stereotypes? Simon asked. What do you mean by that? I asked, nettled. Tie him to the wagon and make him pull? Oh! Simon made a disgusted noise. I'd be offended if I didn't know you. If I didn't know you, I said hotly, I'd be offended. Do you know Aturans used to kill people if they found them living on the road? One of your emperors declared them to be detrimental to the empire. Most were little more than beggars who had lost their homes because of the wars and taxes. Most were simply press-ganged into military service. I tugged at the front of my shirt. But the Adema were especially prized. They hunted us like foxes. For 100 years, Rue hunt was a favorite pastime among the Aturan upper crust. A profound silence fell. My throat hurt, and I realized I'd been shouting. Simon's voice was muffled. I didn't know that. I kicked myself mentally and sighed. Oh, I'm sorry, Simon. It was a long time ago, and it's not your fault. It's an old story. It would have to be to have a reference to the Amia, Willem said, obviously trying to change the subject. They disbanded, 300 years ago? Still, I said, there's some truth in most stereotypes. A seed they sprouted from. Basil was from Vinthus, Will said, and he's odd about certain things. Sleeps with a penny underneath his pillow, that sort of thing. On my way to the university, I travelled with a pair of Ardennes mercenaries, Simon said. They didn't talk to anyone except each other, and they were restless and fidgety. Willem spoke hesitantly. I will admit to knowing many Kaeldem who take great care to line their boots with silver. Purses, Simon corrected him. Boots are for putting your feet in. He wiggled a foot to illustrate. I know what a boot is, Willem said crossly. I speak this vulgar language better than you do. Boot is what we say, patu. Money in your purse is for spending. Money you plan to keep is in your boot. Oh, Simon said thoughtfully. I see. Like saving it for a rainy day, I guess. What do you do with money when it rains? Willem asked, genuinely puzzled. And there's more to the story than you think, I interjected quickly before things digressed any further. The story holds a kernel of truth. If you promise to keep it to yourselves, I will tell you a secret. I felt their attention sharpen onto me. If you ever accept the hospitality of a traveling troupe, and they offer you wine before anything else, they are a Damaroo. That part of the story is true. I held up a finger to caution them. But don't take the wine. But I like wine, Simon said piteously. That doesn't matter, I said. Your host offers you wine, but you insist on water. It might even turn into a competition of sorts, the host offering more and more grandly, the guest refusing more and more politely. When you do this, they will know you are a friend of the Adema, that you know our ways. They will treat you like family for the night, as opposed to being a mere guest. The conversation lulled as they absorbed this piece of information. I looked up at the stars, tracing the familiar constellations in my head. Ewan the Hunter, the Crucible, the Young Again Mother, the Fire-Tongued Fox, the Broken Tower. Where would you go if you could go anywhere? Simon's question came out of the blue. Across the river, I said. Bed. No, he protested. I mean, if you could go anywhere in the world. Same answer, I said. I've been to a lot of places. This is where I've always wanted to go. But not forever, Willem said. You don't want to be here forever, do you? That's what I meant, Simon added. We all want to be here, but none of us want to be here forever. Except Manet, Will said. Where would you go? Simon pursued his point doggedly. For adventure. I thought for a moment quietly. I guess I'd go to the Talenwald, I said. Among the Tal? Willem asked. They're a primitive, nomadic people, from what I've heard. Technically speaking, the Damaroo are a nomadic people, I said dryly. I heard a story once that said the leaders of their tribes aren't great warriors, they're singers. Their songs can heal the sick and make the trees dance. I shrugged. I'd go there and find out if it was true. I would go to the Faire court, Willem said. Simon laughed. You can't pick that. Why not? Willem said with a quick anger. If Quoth can go to a singing tree, I can go into Fane and dance with Embrula, with Fane women. The Tal is real, Simon protested. Fairy stories are for drunks, half-wits and children. Where would you go? I asked Simon to keep him from antagonizing Willem. There was a long pause. I don't know, he said, his voice oddly empty of any inflection. I haven't been anywhere, really. I only came to the university because after my brother's inherit and my sister gets her dowry, there isn't going to be much for me except the family name. You didn't want to come here? I asked, disbelief coloring my voice. Sim made a non-committal shrug, and I was about to ask him something else when I was interrupted by the sound of Willem getting noisily to his feet. Are we feeling up to the bridge now, eh? My head felt remarkably clear. I got to my feet with only a slight wobble. Fine by me. Just a second. Simon started to undo his pants as he moved towards the trees. As soon as he was out of sight, Willem leaned close to me. Don't ask about his family, he said quietly. It is not easy for him to speak about. Worse when he's drunk. What? He made a sharp motion with his hand, shaking his head. Later. Simon bumbled back into the clearing, and the three of us made our silent way back to the road, then over Stonebridge, and into the university. Chapter 39. Contradictions. Late next morning, Will and I made our way to the archives to meet up with Sim and settle our bets of the night before. The problem is his father, Willem explained in low tones as we made our way between the grey buildings. Sim's father holds a duchy in Ator. Good land, but... Hold on, I interrupted. Our little Sim's father is a duke. Little Sim, Willem said dryly. is 3 years older than you and 2 inches taller. Which duchy? I asked. And he's not that much taller. Dalanir, Willem said. But you know how it is. Noble blood from Atur, small wonder he does not speak of it. Oh, come on, I chided, gesturing to the students filling the street around us. The university has the most open-minded atmosphere since the church burned Caliptana to the ground. I notice you do not make any loud announcement that you're a Demaru. I bristled. Are you implying I'm embarrassed? I am saying you make no loud announcement, Will said calmly, giving me a steady look. Neither does Simon. I imagine you both have your reasons. Pushing down my irritation, I nodded. Willem continued. Dalanir is on the north of Aturna, so they're reasonably well off. But he has 3 older brothers and 2 sisters. The first son inherits. The father bought the second a military commission. The third was placed in the church. Simon, Willem trailed off suggestively. I have a hard time imagining Sim as a priest, I admitted. Or a soldier, come to think of it. And so Sim ends up at the university, Willem finished. His father was hoping he would become a diplomat. Then Sim discovered he liked alchemy and poetry and entered the Arcanum. His father was not entirely pleased. Willem gave me a significant look, and I gathered he was drastically understating the case. Being an arcanist is a remarkable thing, I protested. Much more impressive than being a perfumed toady in some court. Willem shrugged. His tuition is paid. His allowance continues. He paused to wave at someone on the other side of the courtyard. But Simon does not go home, not for even a brief visit. Sim's father likes to hunt, fight, drink, and wench. I suspect our gentle, bookish Sim was probably not given the love a clever son deserves. Will and I met up with Sim in our usual reading hole and clarified the details of our drunken wages. Then we went our separate ways. An hour later, I returned with a modest armload of books. My search had been made considerably easier by the fact that I'd been researching the Amir since Nina had arrived and given me her scroll. I knocked softly on the door of the reading hole, then let myself in. Will and Sim were already sitting at the table. Me first, Simon said happily. He consulted a list, then pulled a book from his stack. Page 152. He leafed through until he found the page and then began to scan it. Aha! The girl then gave an account of everything, blah, 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 and led them to the place where she stumbled onto the pagan frolic. He looked up, pointing at the page. See? It says pagan, right there. I sat down. See the rest? Sim's second book was more of the same, but the third held something of a surprise. A large preponderance of marker stones in the vicinity, suggesting this area might have been crossed with trade routes in some forgotten past. He trailed off, then shrugged and handed the book to me. This one seems to be on your side. I couldn't help but laugh. Huh, didn't you read these before you brought them here? In an hour? He gave a laugh of his own. Not likely. I just used a scriv. Willem gave him a dark look. Oh, you didn't. You asked Poppet, didn't you? Simon assumed an innocent expression, which on his naturally innocent face only served to make him look profoundly guilty. I might have stopped in to see him, he hedged, and he might have happened to suggest a couple of books that had information about greystones. Seeing Willem's expression, he raised a hand. Don't get sniffy on me, it's backfired anyway. Puppet again, I grumbled. Are you ever going to introduce me? The two of you are so tight-lipped about him. Willem shrugged. You will understand when you meet them. Sim's books divided into 3 categories. One supported his side, telling of pagan rites and animal sacrifices. The other speculated about an ancient civilization that used them as marker stones for roads, despite the fact that some were located on sheer mountainsides or river bottoms where no road could be. His final book was interesting for other reasons. A pair of matched stone monoliths with a third across the top, Simon read. The locals refer to it as the doorpost. While spring and summer pageants involve decorating and dancing around the stone, parents forbid their children from spending time near it when the moon is full. One well-respected and otherwise reasonable old man claimed. Sim broke off reading. Whatever, he said disgustedly and moved to close the book. Claimed what? Willem asked, his curiosity piqued. Simon rolled his eyes and continued reading. Claimed at certain times men could pass through the stone door into the fair land where Valerian herself abides, loving and destroying men with her embrace. Interesting, Willem murmured. No, it isn't. It's childish, superstitious bunk, Simon said testily. And none of this is getting us any closer to deciding who's right. How do you count them, Willem? I asked. You're our impartial judge. Willem moved to the table and looked through the books. His dark eyebrows moved up and down as he considered. 7 for Simon, 6 for Quoth, 3 contrary. We looked briefly at the 4 books I had brought. Willem ruled one of them out, which brought the tally to 7 for Simon and 10 for me. Hardly conclusive, Willem mused. We could declare it a draw, I suggested magnanimously. Simon scowled. Good-natured or not, he hated losing a bet. Fair enough, he said. I turned to Willem and gave a significant look at the pair of books still untouched on the table. It looks like our bet will be settled a little more quickly, yeah? Willem gave a predatory grin. Very quickly. He lifted a book. Here I have a copy of the proclamation which disbanded the Amir. He opened to a marked page and began to read. Their actions will henceforth be held in account by the laws of the Empire. No member of the Order shall presume to take upon themselves the right to hear a case, nor to pass judgment in court. He looked up smugly. See, if they had their adjudicating powers revoked, then they must have had some to begin with, so it stands to reason they were a part of the Aturan bureaucracy. Actually, I said apologetically, the Church has always had judiciary powers in Artur. I held up one of my 2 books. It's funny you should bring the Alpora Prolicia Amir. I brought it too. The decree itself was issued by the Church. Willem's expression darkened. No, it wasn't. It was listed in here as Emperor Nalto's 63rd decree. Puzzled, we compared our 2 books and found them directly contradictory. Well, I guess those cancel each other out, Sim said. What else have you guys got? This is Feltemi Race, the lights of history, Willem grumbled. It is definitive. I didn't think I would need any further proof. Doesn't this bother either of you? I thumped the 2 contradictory books with a knuckle. These shouldn't be saying different things. We just read 20 books saying different things, Simon pointed out. Why would I have a problem with 2 more? The purpose of the Greystones is speculative. There's bound to be a variety of opinions. But the Alpura Prolicia Amir was an open decree. It turned thousands of the most powerful men and women in the Aturan Empire into outlaws. It was one of the primary reasons for the collapse of the Empire. There's no reason for conflicting information. The Order has been disbanded for over 300 years, Simon said. Plenty of time for some contradictions to arise. I shook my head, flipping through both of the books. Contrary opinions are one thing, contrary facts are another. I held up my book. This is The Fall of Empire by Gregor the Lesser. He's a windbag and a bigot, but he's the best historian of his age. I held up Willem's book. Feltemi Race isn't nearly the historian, but he's twice the scholar Gregor was, and scrupulous about his facts. I looked back and forth between the books, frowning. This doesn't make any sense. So what now? Sim said. Another draw. That's disappointing. We need someone to judge, Willem said. A higher authority. Higher than Feltemi Race? I asked. I doubt Lauren can be bothered to settle our bet. Will shook his head, then stood and brushed the wrinkles from the front of his shirt. It means you finally get to meet Puppet. Chapter 40. Puppet. The most important thing is to be polite, Simon said in a hushed tone as we made our way through a narrow hallway lined with books. Our sympathy lamps shot bands of light through the shelves and made the shadows dance nervously. But don't patronize him. He's a bit odd, but he's not an idiot. Just treat him like you would treat anyone else. Except polite, I said sarcastically, tiring of this litany of advice. Exactly, Simon said seriously. Where are we going anyway? I asked, mostly to stop Simon's henpecking. Sub 3, Willem said as he turned to descend a long flight of stone steps. Centuries of use had worn down the stone, making the stairs look as bowed as heavy-laden shelves. As we started down, the shadows made the steps look smooth and dark and edgeless, like an abandoned riverbed worn from the rock. Are you sure he's going to be there? Will nodded. I don't think he leaves his chambers very much. Chambers? I asked. He lives here? Neither of them said anything as Willem led the way down another flight of stairs, then through a long stretch of wide hallway with a low ceiling. Finally, we came to an unremarkable door tucked into a corner. If I hadn't known better, I would have assumed it was one of the countless reading holes scattered throughout the stacks. Just don't do anything to upset him, Simon said nervously. I assumed my most polite expression as Willem rapped on the door. The handle began to turn almost immediately. The door opened a crack, then was thrown wide. Puppet stood framed in the doorway, taller than any of us. The sleeves of his black robe billowed strikingly in the breeze of the opening door. He stared at us haughtily for a moment, then looked puzzled and brought a hand to touch the side of his head.
Wait, I've forgotten my hood,
he said, and kicked the door closed. Odd as his brief appearance had been, I'd noticed something more disturbing. Burned body of God, I whispered. He's got candles in there, does Lauren know? Simon opened his mouth to answer when the door was thrown wide again. Puppet filled the doorway, his dark robe striking against the warm candlelight behind him. He was hooded now, with his arms upraised. The long sleeves of his robes caught the inrush of air and billowed impressively. The same rush of air caught his hood and blew it part way off his head. Damn, he said in a distracted voice. The hood settled half on, half off his head, partially covering one eye. He kicked the door shut again. Willem and Simon remained straight-faced. I refrained from any comment. There was a moment of quiet. Finally, a muffled voice came from the other side of the door. Would you mind knocking again? It doesn't seem quite right otherwise. Obediently, Willem stepped back up to the door and knocked. Once, twice, then the door swung open, and we were confronted with a looming figure in a dark robe. His cowled hood shadowed his face, and the long sleeves of his robe stirred in the wind. Who calls on Taborlin the Great? Puppet intoned, his voice resonant but slightly muted by the deep hood. A hand pointed dramatically. You, Simon? There was a pause, and his voice lost its dramatic resonance. I've seen you already today, haven't I? Simon nodded. I could sense the laughter tumbling around in him, trying to find a way out. How long ago? About an hour. The hood nodded. Was I better this time? He reached up to push the hood back, and I noticed the robe was too big for him, the sleeves hanging down to his fingertips. When his face emerged from the hood, he was grinning like a child playing dress-up in his parents' clothes. You weren't doing Taborlin before, Simon admitted. Oh. Puppet seemed a little put out. How was I this time? The last time, I mean. Was it a good Taborlin? Pretty good, Simon said. Puppet looked at Willem. I like the robe, Will said. I always imagined Taborlin with a gentle voice. Oh. He finally looked at me. Hello? Hello, I said in my politest tone. I don't know you. A pause. Who are you? I'm Quoth. You seem so certain of it, he said, looking at me intently. Another pause. They call me Puppet. Who is they? Who are they? He corrected, raising a finger. I smiled. Who are they, then? Who were they, then? Who are they now? I clarified, my smile growing wider. Puppet mirrored my smile in a distracted way, and made a vague gesture with one hand. You know, them. people. He continued to stare at me the same way I might examine an interesting stone or a type of leaf I'd never seen before. What do you call yourself? I asked. He seemed a little surprised, and his eyes focused onto me in a more ordinary way. That would be telling, I suspect, he said with a touch of reproach. He glanced at the silent Willem and Simon. You should come in now. He turned and walked inside. The room wasn't particularly large, but it seemed bizarrely out of place, nestled in the belly of the archives. There was a deep padded chair, a large wooden table, and a pair of doorways leading into other rooms. Books were everywhere, overflowing shelves and bookcases. They were piled on the floor, scattered across tables, and stacked on chairs. A pair of drawn curtains against one wall surprised me. My mind struggled with the impression that there must be a window behind them, despite the fact that I knew we were deep underground. The room was lit with lamps and candles, long tapers and thick dripping pillars of wax. Each tongue of flame filled me with vague anxiety as I thought of open fire in a building filled with hundreds of thousands of precious books. And there were puppets. They hung from shelves and pegs on walls. They lay crumpled in corners and under chairs. Some were in the process of being built or repaired, scattered among tools across the tabletop. There were shelves full of figurines, each cleverly carved and painted in the shape of a person. On his way to the table, Puppet shrugged out of the black robe and let it fall carelessly to the floor. He was dressed plainly underneath, wrinkled white shirt, wrinkled dark pants, and mismatched socks much mended in the heel. I realized he was older than I'd thought. His face was smooth and unlined, but his hair was pure white and thin on top. Puppet cleared a chair for me, carefully removing a small string puppet from the seat and finding it a place on a nearby shelf. He then took a seat at the table, leaving Willem and Simon standing. To their credit, they didn't seem terribly disconcerted. Digging a little in the clutter on the table, he brought out an irregularly shaped piece of wood and a small knife. He took another long, searching look at my face, then began to methodically whittle, curls of wood falling onto the tabletop. Oddly enough, I had no desire to ask anyone what was going on. When you ask as many questions as I do, you learn when they are appropriate. Besides, I knew what the answers would be. Puppet was one of the talented, not quite sane people who had found a niche for themselves at the university. Arcanum training does unnatural things to students' minds. The most notable of these unnatural things is the ability to do what most people call magic, and we call sympathy, sigiltry, alchemy, naming, and the like. Some minds take to it easily, others have difficulty. The worst of these go mad and end up in Haven. But most minds don't shatter when subjected to the stress of the Arcanum, they simply crack a little. Sometimes these cracks showed in small ways, facial tics, stuttering. Other students heard voices, grew forgetful, went blind, went dumb. Sometimes it was only for an hour or a day. Sometimes it was forever. I guessed Puppet was a student who had cracked years ago. Like Auri, he seemed to have found a place for himself, though I marveled at the fact that Lauren let him live down here. Does he always look like this? Puppet asked Willem and Simon. A small drift of pale wood shavings had gathered around his hands. Mostly, Willem said. Like what? Simon asked. Like he's just thought through his next 3 moves in a game of Tyranny and figured out how he's going to beat you. Puppet took another long look at my face and shaved another strip of wood away. It's rather irritating, really. Willem barked a laugh. Ha! That's his thinking face, Puppet. He wears it a lot, but not all the time. What's tyranny? Simon asked. A thinker, Puppet mused. What are you thinking now? I'm thinking you must be a very careful watcher of people, Puppet, I said politely. Puppet snorted without looking up. Oh, what use is care? What good is watching, for that matter? People are forever watching things. They should be seeing. I see things I look at. I am a seer. He looked at the piece of wood in his hand, then to my face. Apparently satisfied, he folded his hands over the top of his carving,
but not before I glimpsed my own profile cunningly wrought in wood.
Do you know what you have been, what you are not, and what you will be?
He asked. It sounded like a riddle.
No. A seer,
He said with certainty.
because that is what Elia means. Growth is actually a Raylar.
Simon said respectfully. Puppet sniffed disparagingly.
Hardly.
He said, looking at me closely.
You might be a seer eventually, but not yet. Now you are a looker. You'll be a true Elia at some point, if you learn to relax.
He held out the carved wooden face.
What do you see here?
It was no longer an irregular piece of wood. My features, locked in serious contemplation, stared out of the wood grain. I leaned forward to get a closer look. Puppet laughed and thrubbed his hands.
Too late!
He exclaimed, looking childlike for a moment.
You looked too hard and didn't see enough. Too much looking can get in the way of seeing. You see?
Puppet set the carved face on the tabletop so it seemed to be staring at one of the recumbent puppets.
See little wooden quill. See him looking. So intent, so dedicated. He'll look for 100 years, but will he ever see what is in front of him?
Puppet settled back in his seat, his eyes wandering the room in a contented way. Elia means seer? Simon asked. Do the other ranks mean things too?
As a student with full access to the archives, I imagine you can find that out for yourself.
Puppet said, his attention focused on a puppet on the table in front of him. He lowered it to the floor carefully to avoid tangling its strings. It was a perfect miniature of a grey-robed Italian priest. Would you have any advice as to where he could start looking? I asked, playing a hunch.
Ren Felx, dictum.
Under Puppet's direction, the Italian puppet raised himself from the floor and moved each of his limbs as if he were stretching after a long sleep. I'm not familiar with that one. Puppet responded in a distracted voice.
It's on the second floor, in the southeast corner, second row, second rack, third shelf, right-hand side, red leather binding.
The miniature Italian priest walked slowly around Puppet's feet. Clutched tightly in one hand was a tiny replica of the Book of the Path, perfectly fashioned, right down to the tiny spoked wheel painted on the cover. The three of us watched Puppet pull the strings of the little priest, making it walk back and forth before finally coming to sit on one of Puppet's stocking-clad feet. Willem cleared his throat respectfully. Puppet.
Yes?
Puppet replied without looking up from his feet.
You have a question? Or rather, Quell has a question and you're thinking of asking it for him. He is sitting slightly forward in his seat. There is a furrow between his brows and a pursing of the lips that gives it away. Let him ask me. It might do him good.
I froze in place, catching myself doing each of the things he had mentioned. Puppet continued to work the strings of his little tailin. It made a careful, fearful search of the area around his feet, brandishing the book in front of itself, before stepping around table legs and peering into Puppet's abandoned shoes. Its movements were uncanny, and it distracted me to the point where I forgot I was uncomfortable and felt myself relax. I was wondering about the Amir, actually. My eyes remained on the scene, unfolding at Puppet's feet. Another marionette had joined the show, a young girl in a peasant dress. She approached the Telline and held out a hand as if trying to give him something. No, she was asking him a question. The Telline turned his back on her. She laid a timid hand on his arm. He took a haughty step away. I was wondering who disbanded them, Emperor Nalto or the church.
Still looking.
He admonished more gently than before.
You need to go and chase the wind for a while. You are too serious. It will lead you into trouble.
The Telline suddenly turned on the girl. Trembling with rage, it menaced her with the book. She took a startled step backward and stumbled to her knees.
The church disbanded them, of course.
Only an edict from the Pontifex had the ability to affect them. The Talion struck the girl with the book, once, twice, driving her to the ground, where she lay terribly still. Nalto couldn't have told them to cross to the other side of the street. Some slight motion drew Puppet's eye. Oh, dear me, he said, cocking his head toward Willem. See what I see? The head bows slightly, the jaw clenches, but the eyes aren't fixed on anything, aiming the irritation inward. If I were the sort of person who judged by looking, I'd guess Willem had just lost a bet. Don't you know the church frowns on gambling? At Puppet's feet, the priest brandished the book upward at Willem. The Talion brought its hands together and turned away from the crumpled woman. It took a stately step or two away and bowed its head as if praying. I managed to pull my attention away from the tableau and look up at our host. Puppet, I asked, have you read The Lights of History by Rezz? I saw Simon give Willem an anxious look, but Puppet didn't seem to find anything odd about the question. The Talion at his feet stood and started to dance and caper about. Yes? Why would Rezz say the Apura Prolicia Amir was Emperor Nalto's 63rd decree? Rezz wouldn't say any such thing, Puppet said without looking up from the marionette at his feet. That's pure nonsense. But we found a copy of Lights that said exactly that, I pointed out. Puppet shrugged, watching the Talion dance at his feet. It could be a transcription mistake, Willem mused. Depending on the edition of the book, the church itself might be responsible for changing that piece of information. Emperor Nalto is history's favourite whipping boy. It could be the church trying to distance itself from the Amir. They did some terrible things toward the end. Clever, clever, Puppet said. At his feet, the Talion made a sweeping bow in Willem's direction. I was struck by a sudden idea. Puppet, I asked, do you know what is behind the locked door on the floor above this one, the large stone door? The Talion stopped dancing, and Puppet looked up. He gave me a long, stern look. His eyes were serious and clear. I don't think the four-plate door should be of any concern to a student, do you? I felt myself flush. No, sir. I looked away from his eyes. The tension of the moment was broken by the distant sound of the belling tower. Simon cursed softly. I'm late, he said. I'm sorry, Puppet, I've got to go. Puppet stood and hung the Talion on the wall. It's time I got back to my reading, regardless, he said. He moved to the padded chair, sat, and opened a book. Bring this one back sometime. He gestured in my direction without looking up from his book. I have some more work to do on him. Chapter 41. The Greater Good. I looked up at Simon and whispered, Ivare enemeuge. Sim gave a despairing sigh. You are supposed to be studying your physiognomy. It had been a full span since we had set fire to Ambrose's rooms, and winter was finally showing its teeth, covering the university with knee-deep drifts of blowing snow. As was always the case when the weather turned inclement, the archives were full to the brim with industrious students. Since all the reading holes were occupied, Simon and I had been forced to bring our books to tomes. The high-ceilinged, windowless room was more than half full today, but still quiet as a crypt. All the dark stone and muted whispers made the place slightly eerie, making it obvious why students referred to it as tombs. I am studying my physiognomy, I protested softly. I was looking at some of Gibeah's diagrams. Look what I found. I held out a book for him to see. Gibeah, Simeon whispered, horrified. I swear the only reason you study with me is so you can interrupt. He pulled away from the book I was offering him. It's nothing grotesque, I protested. Just here. Just look at what it says here. Simon shoved the book away and my temper flared. Careful, I hissed. This is one of his originals. I found it behind some other books, buried in dead ledgers.
Lauren will cut off my thumbs if anything happens to it. Sim recoiled from the book as if it were red hot.
The original Merciful Taylor, it's probably written on human skin. Get it away from me.
I almost joked about how human skin probably wouldn't take ink, but decided against it when I saw the expression on Sim's face. Still, my expression must have given me away.
You're perverse,
he spat, his voice almost rising to unacceptable levels.
God's mother, don't you know he cut apart living men to watch their organs work? I refuse to look at anything that monster was responsible for.
I set the book down.
You might as well give up studying medicine then,
I said as gently as possible.
Gibeah's research on the human body was the most thorough ever done. His journals are the backbone of modern physics.
Simon's face stayed hard, and he leaned forward so he could speak softly and still be heard.
When the Amir moved against the Duke, they found the bones of 20,000 people. Great pits of bones and ashes. Women and children. 20,000!
Simon sputtered a bit before he could continue.
And those are just the ones they found.
I let him calm himself a bit before I said,
Gibeah wrote 23 volumes concerning the machinery of the body.
I pointed out as gently as I could.
When the Amir moved against him, part of his estate burned, 4 of those volumes and all his notes were lost. Ask Master Arwyll what he would give to have those volumes whole again.
Simon brought his hand down hard on the tabletop, causing several students to look in our direction.
Damn it,
he hissed.
I grew up 30 miles from Gibeah. From my father's hills, you can see the ruins on a cloudless day.
That stilled me. If Sim's family lands were that close, his ancestors must have been fealty-bound to Gibeah. That meant they might have been forced to help him gather subjects for his experiments. Some of his family might have ended up in the pits of bone and ash themselves. I waited a long while before I whispered again.
I didn't know.
He regained most of his composure.
You don't talk about it,
he said stiffly, brushing the hair out of his eyes. We bent to our studies, and it was an hour before Simon spoke again.
What did you find?
He asked too casually, as if not wanting to admit his curiosity.
Here, on the inner leaf,
I whispered excitedly. I opened the cover, and Sim's face twisted unconsciously as he looked down at the page, as if the book smelled of death.
Spilled it all over!
I heard a voice as a pair of older students strolled into the hall. By their rich clothes, I could tell they were both nobility, and while they weren't shouting, they weren't making any effort to be quiet either.
Anisette made him clear up the mess before he let him wash off. He'll smell like urea for a span of days. Ah!
What's here to see? Simon asked, looking down at the page. It's just his name and the dates. Not the middle, look at the top, around the edges of the page. I pointed at the decorative scroll work. Right there.
I'd wager a drab the little pug poisons himself before the term's through,
the other one said.
Were we ever that stupid?
I still don't see anything, Simon said softly, making a baffled gesture with both his elbows on the table. It's pretty enough if you like that sort of thing, but I've never been a great fan of illuminated texts.
We could head to the Twopenny.
The conversation continued several tables away, drawing annoyed looks from surrounding students.
They've got a girl there who plays the pipes. I swear you've never seen anything like her before. And Linton says if you've got a bit of silver, she,
His voice dropped conspiratorially.
She what?
I asked, butting into their conversation as rudely as possible. I didn't need to shout. In the tomes, a normal speaking voice carries the whole room. I'm afraid I didn't quite catch that last bit. The two of them gave me affronted looks, but didn't reply.
What are you doing?
Sim hissed at me, embarrassed. I'm trying to shut them up, I said.
Just ignore them, he said. Here, I'm looking at your damn book. Show me what you want me to see.
Gibeah sketched all his own journals, I said.
This is his original, so it makes sense that he did his own scroll work too, right?
Sim nodded and brushed his hair back from his eyes.
What do you see there?
I slowly pointed from one piece of scroll work to another.
Do you see it?
Sim shook his head. I pointed again, more precisely.
There, I said, and there in the corner.
His eyes widened.
Letters. I? V.
He paused to puzzle them out.
Ivare Enim Euge. That's what you were rambling about.
He pushed the book away.
So what's the point? Aside from the fact that he was nearly illiterate in Tamic. It's not Tamic,
I pointed out.
it's Tema, an archaic usage. What's it even supposed to say?
He looked up from his book, his brow creasing.
Toward great good?
I shook my head.
For greater good,
I corrected.
sound familiar?
I don't know how long she'll be there.
One of the loud pair continued.
If you miss her, you'll regret it.
I told you I can't tonight, maybe on Felling. I'll be free on Felling.
You should go before then, I told him. The Two Pennies crowded Felling night. They gave me irritated looks.
Mind your own business, Lipstick.
The taller one said. That got my back up even more. I'm sorry, weren't you talking to me?
Did it look like I was talking to you?
He said scathingly.
It sounded like it, I said. If I can hear you 3 tables away, you must want me to be part of your conversation.
I cleared my throat.
Ahem. The only alternative is that you're too thick to keep your voice down in the tones.
His face flushed red, and he probably would have replied, but his friend said something in his ear and they both gathered their books and left. There was a quiet scattering of applause as the door closed behind them. I gave my audience a smile and a wave.
The Scrivs would have taken care of that.
Sim reproached softly as we leaned back over the table to talk.
The Scrivs weren't taking care of it,
I pointed out.
Besides, it's quiet again, and that's what matters. Now, what does for greater good remind you of?
The Amir, of course, he said.
It's always the Amir with you lately. What's your point? The point,
I whispered excitedly,
is that Gibeah was a secret member of the Order Amir.
Sim gave me a skeptical look.
It's a bit of a stretch, but I suppose it fits. That was about 50 years before they were denounced by the church. They were pretty corrupt by then.
I wanted to point out that Gibeah wasn't necessarily corrupt. He was pursuing the Amir's purpose, the greater good. While his experiments had been horrifying, his work advanced medicine in ways it was almost impossible to comprehend. His work had probably saved 10 times that many lives in the hundreds of years since. However, I doubted Sim could appreciate my point.
Corrupt or not, he was a secret member of the Amir. Why else would he hide their credo in the front cover of his journal?
Simon shrugged.
Fine. He was one of the Amir. What does that have to do with the price of butter?
I threw up my hands in frustration and struggled to keep my voice low.
That means the Order had secret members before the Church denounced them. That means when the Pontifex disbanded them, the Amir had hidden allies. Allies that could keep them safe. That means the Amir could still exist today, in secret, pursuing their work in subtle ways.
I noticed a change in Simon's face. At first I thought he was about to agree with me. Then I felt a prickle on the back of my neck and realized the truth.
Hello, Master Lauren.
I greeted him respectfully without turning around.
Speaking with students at other tables is not permitted,
He said from behind me.
You are suspended for 5 days.
I nodded, and the two of us came to our feet and gathered up our things. Expressionless, Master Lauren reached out a long hand toward me. I handed Gibeah's journal over without comment, and a minute later we were blinking in the chill winter sunlight outside the archive's doors. I pulled my cloak around me and stomped the snow off my feet.
Suspended,
Simon said. That was clever. I shrugged, more embarrassed than I cared to admit. I hoped one of the other students would explain I was actually trying to keep things quiet rather than the other way around. I was just trying to do the right thing. Simon laughed as we began to walk slowly in the direction of Bankalts. He kicked playfully at a small drift of snow.
The world needs people like you,
Simon said in a tone of voice that let me know he was turning philosophical.
You get things done. Not always the best way or the most sensible way, but it gets done nonetheless. You're a rare creature.
How do you mean? I asked, my curiosity piqued. Sim shrugged.
Like today, something bothers you, someone offends you, and suddenly you're off.
He made a quick motion with a flat hand. You know exactly what to do. You never hesitate, you just see and react. He was thoughtful for a moment. I imagine that's the way the Amir used to be. Small wonder folk were frightened of them. Not always so terribly sure of myself, I admitted. Simon smiled. I find that strangely reassuring. Chapter 42. Penance. Since studying wasn't an option, and winter was covering everything in drifts of blowing snow, I decided this was the perfect time to catch up on a few things I'd been letting fall by the wayside. I tried to pay Auri a visit, but ice covered the rooftops, and the courtyard where we usually met was full of drifted snow. I was glad I didn't see any footprints, as I didn't think Auri owned shoes, let alone a coat or hat. I would have gone searching for her in the underthing, but the iron grate in the courtyard was locked and iced over. I worked a few double shifts in the Medica and played an extra night at Anchors as an apology for the evening when I'd had to leave early. I worked long hours in the fishery, calculating, running tests and casting alloys for my project. I also made a point of catching up on a month of lost sleep. But there is only so much sleeping one person can do, and by the 4th day of my suspension I'd run out of excuses. As much as I didn't want to, I needed to talk to Debbie. By the time I made up my mind to go, the weather had warmed just enough so that the falling snow had turned to sheets of freezing sleet. It was a miserable walk to Imre. I didn't have hat or gloves, and the wind-driven sleet soaked my cloak within 5 minutes. In 10 minutes I was wet through to the skin and wishing I'd waited or spent the money on a carriage. The sleet had melted the snow on the road, and the damp slush was inches thick. I stopped by the Aeolian to warm myself a bit before heading to Debbie's. But the building was locked and lightless for the first time I'd ever seen it. Small wonder. What noble would come out in this weather? What musician would expose their instrument to the freezing damp? So I slogged my way through the deserted streets, eventually coming to the alley behind the butcher's shop. It was the first time I could remember the stairway not smelling of rancid fat. I knocked on Debbie's door, alarmed by how numb my hand was. I could barely feel my knuckles hitting the door. I waited for a long moment, then knocked again, worried that she might not be in, and I'd come all this way for nothing. The door opened, just a little. Warm lamplight and a single icy blue eye peered out through the crack. Then the door opened wide. "Tail whose tits and teeth," Debbie said. "What are you doing out in this?" I thought, "No, you didn't," she said disparagingly. "Get in here." I stepped inside, dripping, the hood of my cloak plastered to my head. She closed the door behind me, then locked and bolted it. Looking around, I noticed she'd added a second bookshelf, though it was still mostly bare. I shifted my weight, and a great mass of damp slush dislodged itself from my cloak and splattered wetly onto the floor. Debbie gave me a long, dispassionate looking over. I could see a fire crackling in the grate on the other side of the room near her desk. She made no indication that I should come any further into the room, so I remained where I was, dripping and shivering. "You never do things the easy way, do you?" she said. "There's an easy way?" I asked. She didn't laugh. "If you think showing up here half frozen and looking like a kicked dog is going to improve my disposition toward you, you're terribly..." She trailed off and looked at me thoughtfully for another long moment. "I'll be damned," she said, sounding surprised. "I actually do like seeing you like this. It's lifting my spirits to an almost irritating degree." "It wasn't really my intention," I said, "but I'll take it. Would it help if I caught a terrible cold?" Debbie considered it. "It might," she admitted. "Penance does involve a certain amount of suffering." I nodded, not having to work to look miserable. I dug into my purse with clumsy fingers and brought out a small bronze coin I'd won off Sim playing low-stakes breath several nights ago. Debbie took it. "A penance piece?" she said, unimpressed. "Is this supposed to be symbolic?" I shrugged, causing more slush to spatter to the floor. "Somewhat," I said.
I thought of going to a money changer and settling my entire debt with you in penance coin. What stopped you? She asked. I realized it would just irritate you, I said, and I wasn't looking forward to paying the money changer's fee. I fought the urge to look longingly at the fireplace. I spent a lot of time trying to think of some gesture that might make a suitable apology to you. You decided it would be best to walk here during the worst weather of the year. I decided it would be best if we talked, I said. The weather was just a happy accident. Devi scowled and turned toward the fireplace. Come in, then. She walked over to a chest of drawers near her bed and brought out a thick blue cotton robe. She handed it to me and motioned to a closed door. Go and change out of your wet clothes, wring them out in a basin, or they'll take forever to dry. I did as she said, then brought the clothes out and hung them on the pegs in front of the fire. It felt wonderful to stand so close to the fireplace. In the light of the fire, I could see that the skin under my fingernails was actually a little blue. As much as I wanted to linger and warm myself, I joined Devi at her desk. I noticed that the top of it had been sanded down and revarnished, though it still bore a coal-black ring where the poor boy had charred the wood. I felt rather vulnerable sitting there wearing nothing but the robe she'd given me. But there was nothing to be done about it. After our previous meeting, I fought to avoid looking at the charred ring on her desk. You informed me that the full amount of my loan would be due at the end of the term. Are you willing to renegotiate that? Unlikely, Debbie said crisply. But rest assured that if you are unable to settle accounts in coin, I'm still in the market for certain pieces of information. She gave a sharp, hungry smile. I nodded. She still wanted access to the archives. I was hoping you might be willing to reconsider as you now know the whole story, I said. Someone was performing malfeasance against me. I needed to know that my blood was safe. I gave her a questioning look. Devi shrugged without taking her elbows off the desk, her expression one of vast indifference. What's more, I said, meeting her eye, it is entirely possible that my irrational behavior might have been partially due to the lingering effect of an alchemical poison I was subjected to earlier this term. Devi's expression went stiff. What? She hadn't known. That was something of a relief. Ambrose arranged to have me dosed with the plum ball about an hour before my admissions interview, I said, and you sold him the formula. You have a lot of gall. Devi's pixie face was outraged and indignant, but it wasn't convincing. She was off balance and trying too hard. What I have, I said calmly, is the lingering taste of plum and nutmeg in my mouth and the occasional irrational desire to choke people for doing nothing more offensive than jostling me on the street. Her false outrage fell away. You can't prove anything, she said. I don't need to prove anything, I said. I have no desire to see you in trouble with the Masters or up against the Iron Law. I looked at her. I just thought you might be interested in the fact that I was poisoned. Devi sat very still. She fought to maintain her composure, but guilt was creeping onto her expression. Was it bad? It was, I said quietly. Devi looked away and crossed her arms in front of her chest. I didn't know it was for Ambrose, she said. Some rich tosh came around, made a stunningly good offer. She looked back at me. Now that the chilly anger had left her, she looked surprisingly small. I'd never do business with Ambrose, she said. And I didn't know it was for you, I swear. You knew it was for someone, I said. There was a long moment of silence, broken only by the occasional crackling of the fire. Here's how I see it, I said. Recently we've both done something rather foolish. Something we regret. I pulled the robe more closely around my shoulders. And while these two things certainly don't cancel each other out, it does seem to me that they establish some sort of equilibrium. I held out my hands, like they were the balancing plates on a scale. Devi gave me a small, embarrassed smile. Perhaps I was hasty in demanding full repayment. I returned the smile and felt myself relax. How would you feel about sticking to the original terms of our loan? That seems fair. Devi held out her hand over the desk and I shook it. The last of the tension in the room evaporated, and I felt a long-standing piece of worry unknot itself in my chest. Your hand is freezing, Devi said. Let's go sit by the fire. We relocated ourselves and sat quietly for several minutes. Gods below, Devi said with an explosive sigh. I was so angry with you. She shook her head. I don't know if I've ever been that angry with anyone in my whole life. I nodded. I didn't really believe you'd stoop to malfeasance, I said. I was so sure it couldn't be you, but everyone kept talking about how dangerous you were, telling stories. Then when you wouldn't let me see my blood... I trailed off, shrugging. Are you really still getting after echoes from the plum bob? She asked. Little flashes, I said. And I seem to be losing my temper more easily. But that might just be the stress. Simon says I probably have unbound principles in my system. Debbie scowled. I'm working with less than ideal equipment here, she said, gesturing to a closed door. And I am sorry, but the fellow offered me a full set of walking technostats. She waved at the bookshelves. Normally I'd never make something like that, but unexpurgated copies are just impossible to find. I turned to look at her, surprised. You made it for him? It's better than handing over the formula, Debbie said defensively. Part of me felt like I should be angry, but the majority of me was simply happy that I was warm and dry, with no threat of death hanging over me. I shrugged it off. Simon says you can't factor worth half a damn, I said conversationally. Debbie looked down at her hands. I'm not proud of selling it, she admitted. Then after a moment she looked up again, grinning. But the Technostat has gorgeous illustrations. I laughed. Show me. Hours later, my clothes were dry, and the sleet had changed to a gentle snow. Stonebridge would be a solid sheet of ice, but other than that, the walk home would be much more pleasant. When I emerged from the washroom, I saw Debbie was sitting back at her desk. I made my way over and handed her the robe. I won't impugn your honor by asking why you own a robe much longer and broader in the shoulder than anything a delicate young lady of your size could ever wear. Debbie snorted indelicately and rolled her eyes. I sat down and tugged on my boots. They were delightfully warm from sitting near the fire. Then I brought out my purse and laid 3 heavy silver talents on the desk, pushing them toward her. Debbie looked at them curiously. I've recently come into a little money, I said. Not enough to settle my whole debt, but I can pay this term's interest early. I waved a hand at the coins, a gesture of good faith. Debbie smiled and pushed the coins back across the table. You've still got 2 span before the end of term, she said. Like I said, let's stick to our original deal. I'd feel bad about taking your money early. Though I'd offered Debbie the money as an honest peace offering, I was glad to keep my 3 talents for now. There is a vast difference between having some coin and no coin. There is a feeling of helplessness that comes from having an empty purse. It's like seed grain. At the end of a long winter, if you have some grain left, you can use it for seed. You have control over your life. You can use that grain and make plans for the future. But if you have no grain for seed in the spring, you are helpless. No amount of hard work or good intention will make crops grow if you don't have the seed to start with. So I bought clothes, 3 shirts, a new pair of pants, and thick woolen socks. I bought a hat and gloves and scarf to keep away the winter's chill. For Auri, I bought a pouch of sea salt, a sack of dried peas, 2 jars of peach preserves, and a pair of warm slippers. I bought a set of lute strings, ink, and a half-dozen sheets of paper. I also bought a sturdy brass drop bar and screwed it to the window frame in my tiny garret room. I could circumvent it fairly easily, but it would keep my few possessions safe from even the most well-intentioned thieves. Chapter 43.
without word or warning. I stared out the front window of Anchor's, looking at the falling snow and idly turning Denna's ring over in my fingers. Winter lay heavy over the university, and Denna had been gone for more than a month. I had 3 hours before class with Elodine, and I was trying to decide if the slim chance of finding Denna was worth the long, cold walk to Imre. As I stood at the window, a Kael'dish man came through the door, stomping the powdery snow from his boots and looking around curiously. It was still early in the day, and I was the only person in common. He walked over to me, snowflakes melting in his beard until there were bright beads of water.
"Sorry to bother you, I'm looking for a fellow,"
he said, surprising me with his utter lack of anything resembling a Kael'dish accent. He reached inside his long coat and pulled out a thick envelope with a blood-red seal.
"Ka voth e,"
he read slowly, then turned the envelope toward me so I could see the front. Quoth, Anchor's Inn, University, 2 miles west of Imre. Berenay Baron, Central Commonwealth. It was Denna's handwriting. It's Quoth, actually, I said absent-mindedly. The E is silent. He shrugged.
"You him?"
I am, I said. He nodded, satisfied.
"Well, I got this down in Tarbine about a span back. Bought it off a fellow for a hard penny. He said he bought it off a sailor in Junqui for a vintage silver bit. He couldn't remember the name of the town where the sailor had got it from, but it was inland a ways."
The man met my eye.
"I'm telling you this so you don't think I'm trying to shim you on the deal. I paid a full hard penny, then came over myself from Imre, though it was out of my way."
He looked around the common room.
"Though I'm guessing a fellow with a fine end such as this won't quibble about giving a fellow his due."
I laughed. "This isn't my inn," I said. "I just have a room here."
"Oh,"
he said, obviously a little disappointed.
"You look kinda proprietorial standing there. Still, I'm sure you see I need to make my money off this."
I do, I said. How much do you think is fair? He looked me up and down, eyeing my clothes.
"I suppose I'd be happy making my hard penny back and a soft penny besides."
I brought out my purse and fished around it. Luckily, I'd been playing cards a few nights before and had some Aturan currency. "Seems fair," I said as I handed over the money. He started to go, then turned back. "Out of curiosity," he asked, "would you have paid 2 hard pennies to get it?" "Probably," I admitted. "Kissed," he swore, then headed back outside, the door banging behind him. The envelope was heavy parchment, wrinkled and smudged with much handling. The seal showed a stag rampant, standing before a barrel and a harp. I pressed it hard between my fingers, chattering it as I sat down. The letter read, Quoth, I'm sorry to leave Imre without word or warning. I sent you a message the night of my departure, but I expect you never received it. I have gone abroad looking for greener pasture and better opportunity. I am fond of Imre and enjoy the pleasure of your occasional, though sporadic, company. But it is an expensive city in which to live, and my prospects have grown slender of late. Hill is lovely, all rolling hills. I find the weather quite to my liking. It is warmer, and the air smells of the sea. It seems I might pass an entire winter without being brought to bed by my lungs, my first in years. I have spent some time in the small kingdoms and saw a skirmish between 2 bands of mounted men. Such a crashing and screaming of horses you have never heard. I spent some time afloat as well and learned all manner of sailors' knots and how to spit properly. Also, my cussing has been greatly broadened. If you ask politely when we next meet, I may demonstrate my newfound skills. I have seen my first Ardim mercenary, they call them blood shirts here. She is hardly bigger than me, with quite the most remarkable grey eyes. She is pretty, but strange and quiet, endlessly twitching. I have not seen her fight, and am not sure I wish to, though I am curious. I am still enamored of the harp, and am currently housing with a skilled gentleman, whom I shall not name, for the furtherance of my study in this.
I have drunk some wine while writing this letter. I mention this to excuse my above spelling of the word furtherance. Furtherance. Kiss. You know what I mean. I apologize for not writing sooner, but I have been a great deal traveling, and not until now have I had means to write a letter. Now that I have done, I expect it might be a while longer before I find a traveler I trust to start this missive on its long road back to you. I think of you often and fondly. Yours, D. Postscript, I hope your loot case is serving you well. Elodine's class began strangely that day. For one, Elodine was actually on time. This caught us unprepared, as the 6 remaining students had taken to spending the first 20 or 30 minutes of the class gossiping, playing cards, and griping about how little we were learning. We didn't even notice Master Namer until he was halfway down the steps of the lecture hall, clapping his hands to get our attention. The second odd thing was that Elodine was dressed in his formal robes. I'd seen him wear them before when occasion demanded, but always grudgingly. Even during admissions interviews, they were usually rumpled and unkempt. Today he wore them as if he meant it. They looked sharp and freshly laundered. His hair wasn't in its normal state of dishevel either. It looked like it had been trimmed and combed. Reaching the front of the lecture hall, he climbed onto the dais and moved to stand behind the lectern. This, more than anything, made everyone sit up and take notice. Elodine never used the lectern.
Long ago,
he said without any preamble,
this was a place where people came to learn secret things. Men and women came to university to study the shape of the world.
Elodine looked out at us.
In this ancient university, there was no skill more sought after than naming. All else was base metal. Namers walked these streets like tiny gods. They did terrible, wonderful things, and all others envied them. Only through skill in naming did students move through the ranks. An alchemist without any skill in naming was regarded as a sad thing, no more respected than a cook. Sympathy was invented here, but a sympathist without any naming might as well be a carriage driver. An artificer with no names behind his work was little more than a cobbler or a smith. They all came to learn the names of things,
Elodine said, his dark eyes intense, his voice resonant and stirring.
But naming cannot be taught by rule or rote. Teaching someone to be a namer is like teaching someone to fall in love. It is hopeless. It cannot be done.
Master Namer smiled a bit then, for the first time looking like his familiar self.
Still, students tried to learn, and teachers tried to teach. And sometimes they succeeded.
Elodine pointed.
Faire!
He motioned for her to approach.
Come!
Faire stood, looking nervous as she climbed up to join him on the lecturer's dais.
You have all chosen the name you hope to learn,
Elodine said, his eyes sweeping over us.
And you have all pursued your studies with varying degrees of dedication and success.
I fought the urge to look away shamefacedly, knowing that my efforts had been half-hearted at best.
Where you have failed, Faire has succeeded,
Elodine said.
She has found the name of stone.
He turned sideways to look at her.
How many times?
8 times, she said, looking down, her hands twisting nervously in front of her. There was a murmur of genuine awe from all of us. She had never mentioned this in our frequent griping sessions. Elodine nodded, as if approving of our reaction.
When naming was still taught, we namers wore our prowess proudly. A student who gained mastery over a name would wear a ring as declaration of their skill.
Elodine stretched out a hand in front of Faire and opened it, revealing a river stone, smooth and dark.
And this is what Faire will do now, as proof of her ability.
Startled, Faire looked at Elodine. Her eyes flickered back and forth between him and the stone, her face growing stricken and pale. Elodine gave her a reassuring smile.
Come now,
he said gently.
You know in your secret heart you are capable of this and more.
Faire bit her lips and took hold of the stone. It seemed bigger in her hands than it had in his. She closed her eyes for a moment and drew a long, deep breath. She let it out slowly, lifted the stone and opened her eyes so it was the first thing she would see. Faire stared at the stone, and there was a long moment's silence. The tension in the room built until it was tight as a harp string. The air vibrated with it. A long minute passed. 2 long minutes. 3 terribly long minutes. Elodine sighed gustily, breaking the tension. "No, no, no," he said, snapping his fingers near her face to get her attention. He pressed a hand over her eyes like a blindfold. "You're looking at it. Don't look at it. Look at it." He pulled his hand away. Faire lifted the stone and opened her eyes. At the same moment, Elodine gave her a sharp slap on the back of the head with the flat of his hand. She turned to him, her expression outraged, but Elodine merely pointed at the stone she still held in her hand. "Look!" he said excitedly. Faire's eyes went to the stone, and she smiled as if seeing an old friend. She covered it with a hand and brought it close to her mouth. Her lips moved. There was a sudden, sharp cracking sound as if a speck of water had been dropped into a pan of hot grease. There followed dozens more, so sharp and quick they sounded like an old man popping his knuckles, or a storm of hailstones hitting a hard slate roof. Faire opened her hand, and a scattering of sand and gravel spilled out. With 2 fingers, she reached into the jumble of loose stone and pulled out a ring of sheer black stone. It was as round as a cup and as smooth as polished glass. Elodine laughed in triumph before sweeping Faire into an enthusiastic hug. Faire threw her arms around him wildly in return. They took several quick steps together that were half stagger, half dance. Still grinning, Elodine held out his hand. Faire gave him the ring, and he looked it over carefully before nodding. "Faire," he said seriously, "I hereby promote you to the rank of Raylar." He held up the ring. "Your hand." Almost shyly, Faire held out her hand, but Elodine shook his head. "Left hand," he said firmly. "The right means something else entirely. None of you are anywhere near ready for that." Faire held out her other hand, and Elodine slid the ring of stone easily onto her finger. The rest of the class broke into applause, rushing close to get a look at what she had done. Faire gave a radiant smile and held out her hand for all of us to see. The ring wasn't as smooth as I'd first thought. It was covered in 1,000 tiny, flat facets. They circled each other in a subtle, swirling pattern, unlike anything I'd ever seen before. Chapter 44. The Catch. Despite the trouble with Ambrose, my obsession with the archives, and my countless fruitless trips to Imre hunting dinner, I managed to finish my project in the fishery. I would have liked another span of days to run a few more tests and tinker with it, but I was simply out of time. The admissions lottery was coming up soon, and my tuition would be due not long after. Before I could put my project up for sale, I needed Kilvin to approve my design. So it was with no small amount of trepidation that I knocked on the door of Kilvin's office. The Master Artificer was hunched over his personal work table, carefully removing the screws from the bronze casing of the compression pump. He didn't look up as he spoke. "Yes, Raylar quoth." "I'm finished, Master Kilvin," I said simply. He looked up at me, blinking. "How do you know?" "Yes, I was hoping to make an appointment so I might demonstrate it to you." Kilvin set the screws in a tray and brushed his hands together. "For this I am available now." I nodded and led the way through the busy workshop, past stocks to the private workroom Kilvin had assigned me. I brought out the key and unlocked the heavy timber door. It was large, as workrooms go, with its own fire well, anvil, fuel, drench, and other assorted staples of the artisan trade. I'd pushed the work table aside to leave half of the room empty except for several thick bales of straw stacked against the wall. Hanging from the ceiling in front of the bales was a crude scarecrow,
I dressed it in my burned shirt and a pair of sackcloth pants. Part of me wished I'd run a few more tests in the time it had taken to sew the pants and stuff the straw man. But at the end of the day, I'm a trooper first and all else second. As such, I couldn't ignore the chance for a little showmanship. I closed the door behind us while Kilvin looked around the room curiously. Deciding to let my work speak for itself, I brought out the crossbow and handed it to him. The huge master's expression went dark.
Relar quoth,
He said, his voice heavy with disapproval.
tell me you have not squandered the labor of your hands on the improvement of such a beastly thing.
Trust me, Master Kilvin, I said, holding it out to him. He gave me a long look, then took the crossbow and began to examine it with the meticulous care of a man who spent every day working with deadly equipment. He fingered the tightly woven string and eyed the curved metal arm of the bow. After several long minutes, he nodded, put one foot through the stirrup and cocked it without any noticeable effort. Idly, I wondered how strong Kilvin was. My shoulders ached and my hands were blistered from struggling with the unwieldy thing over the last several days. I handed him the heavy bolt and he examined it as well. I could see him looking increasingly perplexed. I knew why. The bow didn't have any obvious modifications or sigildry. Neither did the bolt. Kilvin slotted the bolt into the crossbow and raised an eyebrow at me. I made an expansive gesture to the straw man, trying to look more confident than I felt. My hands were sweating and my stomach was full of doves. Tests were fine and good, tests were important, tests were like rehearsal. But all that really matters is what happens when the audience is watching. This is a truth all troopers know. Kilvin shrugged and raised the crossbow. It looked small, braced against his broad shoulder. He took a moment to carefully sight along the top of it. I was surprised to see him calmly draw half a breath and exhale slowly as he pulled the trigger. The crossbow jerked. The string twanged. The bolt blurred. There was a harsh metallic clank, and the bolt stopped mid-air, as if it had struck an invisible wall. It clattered to the stone floor in the middle of the room, 15 feet away from the straw man. Unable to help myself, I laughed and threw my arms triumphantly into the air. Kilvin raised his eyebrows and looked at me. I grinned, a manic grin. The master retrieved the bolt from the floor and examined it again. Then he recocked the crossbow, sighted, and pulled the trigger. Clank! The bolt dropped to the floor a second time, skittering slightly to one side. This time Kilvin spotted the source of the noise. Hanging from the ceiling in the far corner of the room was a metal object the size of a large lantern. It was rocking back and forth and spinning slightly as if someone had just struck it a glancing blow. I took it off its hook and brought it back to where Master Kilvin waited at the work table.
What is this thing, Relar quoth?
He said curiously. I set it down on the table with a heavy clunk. In general terms, Master Kilvin, it's an automatically triggered kinetic opposition device. I beamed proudly. More specifically, it stops arrows. Kilvin bent to look at it, but there was nothing to see except for featureless plates of dark iron. My creation looked like nothing so much as a large 8-sided lantern made entirely of metal.
And what do you call it?
That was the one part of my invention I hadn't managed to finish. I'd thought of 100 names, but none of them seemed to fit. Arrow Trap was pedestrian, the Traveler's Friend was prosaic, Bandit Bane was ridiculously melodramatic. I could never have looked Kilvin in the eye again if I tried to call it that. I'm having some trouble with the name, I admitted, but for now I'm calling it an arrow cat. Kilvin grunted.
Does not catch the arrow, precisely.
I know, I said, exasperated, but it was either that or call it a clank. Kilvin looked at me sideways, his eyes smiling a little.
One would think a student of Elodine's would prove more facile with his naming, Relar quoth.
Delivari had it easy, Master Kilvin, I said. He just made a better axle and stuck his name on it. I can't very well call this the Quoth. Kilvin chuckled.
True. He turned back to the arrow catch, eyeing it curiously.
How does it work?
I grinned and brought out a large roll of paper covered in diagrams, complicated sigildry, metallurgical symbols, and painstaking formulae for kinetic conversion. There are two main parts, I said. The first is the sigildry that automatically forms a sympathetic link with any thin, fast-moving piece of metal within 20 feet. I don't mind telling you, that took me a long couple of days to figure out. I tapped the appropriate runes on the piece of paper. At first I thought that might be enough by itself. I hoped if I bound an incoming arrowhead to a stationary piece of iron, it would absorb the arrow's momentum and make it harmless. Kilvin shook his head.
It has been tried before.
I should have realized before I even tried, I said. At best, it only absorbs a third of the arrow's momentum, and any 1/2 arrow shot is still going to be in a bad way. I gestured to a different diagram. What I really needed was something that could push back against the arrow, and it had to push very fast and very hard. I ended up using the spring steel from a bear trap, modified, of course. I picked up a spare arrowhead from the work table and pretended it was moving toward the arrow catch. First, the arrow comes close and establishes the binding. Second, the incoming arrow's momentum sets off the trigger just like stepping on a trap. I snapped my fingers sharply. Then the spring's stored energy pushes back at the arrow, stopping it or even knocking it backward. Kilvin was nodding along.
If it needs to be reset after each use, how did it stop my second bolt?
I pointed to the central diagram. This wouldn't be of much use if it only stopped one arrow, I said, or if it only stopped arrows coming from one direction. I designed it to have 8 springs in a circle. It should be able to stop arrows from several directions at once. I shrugged apologetically. In theory, I haven't been able to test that. Kilvin looked back at the straw man.
Both of my shots came from the same direction, he said. How was the second one stopped if that spring had already been triggered?
I picked up the arrow catch by the ring I'd set into the top and showed how it could rotate freely. It hangs on a pivot ring, I said. The shock of the first arrow set it spinning slightly, which brought a new spring into alignment. Even if it hadn't, the energy of the incoming arrow tends to swing it around to the nearest untriggered spring, like a weather vane points into the wind. I hadn't actually planned the last. It had been a lucky accident, but I didn't see any reason to tell Kilvin that. I touched the red dots visible on 2 of the 8 iron faces of the arrow catch. These show which springs have been triggered. Kilvin took it from me and turned it in his hands.
How do you reset the springs?
I slid a metal device out from under the work table, little more than a piece of iron with a long lever attached. Then I showed Kilvin the 8-sided hole in the bottom of the arrow catch. I fitted the arrow catch onto the device and pressed down on the lever with my foot until I heard a sharp click. Then I rotated the arrow catch and repeated the process. Kilvin bent to pick it up and turned it over in his huge hands.
Heavy,
he commented. It needed to be sturdy, I said. A crossbow bolt can punch through a 2-inch oak plank. I needed the spring to snap back with at least 3 times that much force to stop the arrow. Kilvin shook the arrow catch idly, holding it to the side of his head. It didn't make any noise.
And what if the arrowheads are not made of metal? He asked. These Simbi raiders are said to use arrows of flint or obsidian.
I looked down at my hands and sighed. Well, I said slowly, if the arrowheads aren't some sort of iron, the arrow catch wouldn't trigger when they came within 20 feet. Kilvin gave a non-committal grunt and set the arrow catch back down on the table with a thump. But, I said brightly, when it came within 15 feet, any piece of sharp stone or glass would trigger a different set of bindings. I tapped my schema. I was proud of it, as I'd also had the foresight to inscribe the inset pieces of obsidian with the sigildry of twice tough glass. That way, they wouldn't shatter under the impact. Kilvin glanced at the schema, then grinned proudly and chuckled deep in his chest.
Good, good. What if the arrow has a head of bone or ivory?
The runes for bone aren't trusted to a lowly railar like myself, I said.
And if they were?
Kilvin asked. Then I still wouldn't use them, I said, lest some child doing a cartwheel trigger the arrow catch with a thin, quickly moving piece of their skull. Kilvin nodded his approval.
I was thinking of a galloping horse, he said. But you show your wisdom in this. You show you have the careful mind of an artificer.
I turned back to the schemer and pointed. That said, Master Kilvin, at 10 feet, a fast-moving cylindrical piece of wood will trigger the arrow catch. I sighed. It's not a good link, but it's enough to stop the arrow, or at least deflect it. Kilvin bent to examine the schemer more closely, his eyes wandering the crowded page for a long couple of minutes.
All iron?
He asked. Closer to steel, Master Kilvin. I worried iron would be too brittle in the long term.
And each of these 18 bindings are inscribed on each of the springs?
He asked, gesturing. I nodded.
That is a great duplication of effort,
Kilvin said, his tone more conversational than accusatory.
Some might say such a thing is overbuilt.
I care very little what other people think, Master Kilvin, I said. Only what you think. He grunted, then looked up from the paper and turned to face me.
I have 4 questions.
I nodded expectantly.
First, of all things, why make this?
He asked. No one should ever die from ambush on the road, I said firmly. Kilvin waited, but I had nothing more to say on the matter. After a moment, he shrugged and gestured to the other side of the room.
Second, where did you get the...
His brow furrowed slightly.
David them. The flatbow.
My stomach clenched at the question. I'd held the vain hope that Kilvin, being Kael'dish, wouldn't know such things were illegal here in the Commonwealth. Barring that, I'd hoped he simply wouldn't ask. I, procured it, Master Kilvin, I said evasively. I needed it to test the arrow catch.
Why not use a simple hunter's bow?
Kilvin said sternly.
And thereby avoid the need of illegal procurement.
It would be too weak, Master Kilvin. I needed to be sure my design would stop any arrow, and a crossbow fires a bolt harder than any other.
A Medigan longbow is equal of a flatbow,
Kilvin said. But the use of one is beyond my skill, I said, and the purchase of a Medigan bow is far beyond my means. Kilvin let out a deep sigh.
Before, when you made your thief's lamp, you made a bad thing in a good way. That I do not like.
He looked down at the streamer.
This time, you have made a good thing in a bad way. That is better, but not entirely. Best is to make a good thing in a good way. Agreed?
I nodded. He lay one massive hand on the crossbow.
Did anyone see you with it?
I shook my head.
Then we will say it is mine, and you procured it under my advisement. It will join the equipment in stocks.
He gave me a hard look.
And in the future, you will come to me if you need such things.
That stung a bit, as I'd been planning on selling it back to Sleet. Still, it could have been worse. The last thing I wanted was to run afoul of the Iron Law.
Third, I see no mention of gold wire or silver in your schema,
he said.
Nor can I imagine any use they could be put to in such a device as yours. Explain why you have checked these materials out of stocks.
I was suddenly pointedly aware of the cool metal of my gram against the inside of my arm. Its inlay was gold, but I could hardly tell him that. I was short on money, Master Kilvin, and I needed materials I couldn't get in stocks.
Such as your flatbow?
I nodded. And the straw and the bear traps.
Wrong follows wrong,
Kilvin said disapprovingly.
The stocks are not a moneylender's stock and should not be used as such. I am rescinding your precious metals authorization.
I bowed my head, hoping I looked appropriately chastised.
You will also work 20 hours in stocks as your punishment. If anyone asks, you will tell them what you did and explain that as a punishment you were forced to repay the value of the metals plus an additional 20%. If you use stocks as a moneylender, you will be charged interest like a moneylender.
I winced at that. Yes, Master Kilvin.
Last.
Kilvin said, turning to lay one huge hand on the arrow catch.
What do you imagine such a thing would sell for? Relar. Quoth.
My heart rose in my chest. Does that mean you approve it for sale, Master Kilvin? The great bear-like artificer gave me a puzzled look.
Of course I approve it, Relar quoth. It is a wondrous thing. It's an improvement to the world. Every time a person sees such a thing, they will see how artificery is used to keep men safe. They will think well of all artificers for the making of such a thing.
He looked down at the arrow catch, frowning thoughtfully.
But if we are to sell it, it must have a price. What do you suggest?
I'd been wondering on this question for 6 spans. The simple truth was I hoped it would bring me enough money to pay for my tuition and my interest on Debbie's loan. Enough to keep me in the university for 1 more term. I honestly don't know, Master Kilvin, I said. How much would you pay to avoid having a long yard of ash arrow shot through your lung? He chuckled.
1 lung is quite valuable, he said. But let's think in other terms. Materials come to...
He glanced at the schemer.
Roughly 9 jots, am I correct?
Uncannily correct, I nodded.
How many hours did it take you to make?
About 100, I said. Maybe 120. But a lot of that was experimentation and testing. I could probably make another in 50 or 60 hours. Less if moldings are made. Kilvin nodded.
I suggest 25 talents. Does that seem reasonable to you?
The sum took my breath away. Even after I repaid stocks for materials and the workshop took its 40% commission, it was 6 times more than I'd earned working on Decklands. An almost ridiculous amount of money. I began to agree enthusiastically. Then a thought occurred to me. Though it pained me, I slowly shook my head. Honestly, Master Kilvin, I'd prefer to sell them more cheaply than that. He raised an eyebrow.
They will pay it,
he reassured me.
I have seen people pay more for less useful things.
I shrugged. 25 talents is a lot of money, I said. Safety and peace of mind shouldn't only be available to those with heavy purses. I think 8 would be a great pleasure. Kilvin looked at me for a long moment, then nodded.
As you say, 8 talents.
He ran his hand over the top of the arrow catch, almost petting it.
However, as this is the first and only one in existence, I will pay you 25 for it. It will go in my personal collection.
He cocked his head at me.
Queen Sadva.
Lynn? I said gratefully, feeling a great weight of anxiety lifting off my shoulders. Kilvin smiled and nodded toward the table.
I would also like to examine the schema at my leisure. Would you like to make me a copy?
For 25 talents, I said, smiling as I slid the paper across the table. You can have the original. Kilvin wrote me a receipt and left, clutching the arrow catch like a child with a new favorite toy. I hurried to stocks with my slip of paper. I had to settle my debt for materials, including the gold wire and silver ingots. But even after the workshop took its commission, I was left with almost 11 talents. I went through the remainder of the day, grinning and whistling like an idiot. It is, as they say, a heavy purse makes for a light heart. Chapter 45. Consortation. I sat on the hearth at anchors with my lute in my lap. The room was warm and quiet, full of people who had come to hear me play.
Felling was my regular night at Anchor's, and it was always busy. Even in the worst weather, there weren't enough chairs, and those who came late were forced to cluster around the bar and lean against walls. Lately, Anchor had needed to bring in an extra girl on Felling night just to hurry drinks around the room. Outside the inn, winter was still clutching at the university, but inside the air was warm and sweet, with the smell of beer and bread and broth. Over the months, I had slowly trained my audience to be properly attentive while I played, so the room was hushed as I fingered my way through the second verse of Violet Vine. I was in fine form that night. My audience had bought me half a dozen drinks, and in a fit of generosity, a tipsy scriv had tossed a hard penny into my loot case where it lay shining among the dull iron and copper. I'd made Simon cry twice, and Anchor's new serving girl was smiling and blushing at me with such frequency that even I couldn't miss the signal. She had beautiful eyes. For the first time I could remember, I actually felt like I had some control over my life. There was money in my purse. My studies were going well. I had access to the archives, and despite the fact that I was forced to work in stocks, everyone knew Kilvin was terribly pleased with me. The only thing missing was dinner. I looked down at my hands as I entered into the final chorus of Violet Vide. I'd had a few more drinks than I was used to, and I didn't want to fumble. As I watched my fingers, I heard the door of the tap room open, and felt a chill wind curl around the room. The fire swayed and danced beside me, as I heard boots moving across the wooden floor. The room was quiet as I sang. She sits by her window, she sips at her tea. She waits for her love to return from the sea. Her suitors come calling, she watches the tides, and all the while Violet bides. I hit the final chord, but instead of the thunderous applause I expected, there was only an echoing quiet. I looked up and saw 4 tall men standing in front of the hearth. The shoulders of their heavy cloaks were wet with melted snow. Their faces were grim. 3 of them wore the dark round caps that marked them as constables. And if that weren't clue enough as to their business, each of them carried a long oak cudgel bound in iron. They watched me like hard-eyed hawks. The 4th man stood aside from the others. He didn't wear a constable's cap and wasn't nearly so tall or broad across the shoulders. Despite that, he carried himself with undeniable authority. His face was lean and grim as he drew out a piece of heavy parchment decorated with several black official-looking seals.
Truth, our leader and son,
he read aloud to the room, his voice clear and strong.
In the sight of these witnesses, I bind you to stand to your own account before the iron law. You are charged with consultation with demonic powers, malicious use of unnatural arts, unprovoked assault, and malfeasance.
Needless to say, I was caught completely flat-footed. What? I said stupidly. As I said, I'd had more than a few drinks. The grim man ignored me and turned to one of the constables.
Bind him.
One of the constables drew out a length of clattering iron chain. Up until now, I'd been too startled to be properly afraid, but the sight of this grim-faced man pulling a pair of dark iron manacles out of a sack filled me with a fear that turned my bones to water. Simon appeared next to the hearth, pushing his way past the constables to stand in front of the 4th man.
What exactly is going on here?
Sim demanded, his voice hard and angry. It was the only time I'd ever heard him sound like the son of a duke.
Explain yourself!
The man holding the parchment eyed Simon calmly, then reached inside his cloak and brought out a stout iron rod with a band of gold around each end. Sim paled a bit as the grim man held it up for everyone in the room to see. Not only was it every bit as threatening as the constable's cudgels, the rod was an unmistakable symbol of his authority. The man was a summoner for the Commonwealth courts. Not just a regular summoner either. The gold bands meant he could order anyone to stand before the iron law, priests, government officials, even members of the nobility up to the rank of baron. At this point, Anchor made his way through the crowd as well. He and Sim looked over the summoner's document and found it to be very legitimate and official. It was signed and sealed by all manner of important people in Imre. There was nothing to be done. I was going to be brought up against the Iron Law. Everyone at Anchor's watched as I was bound hand and foot in chains. Some of them looked shocked, some confused, but most of them simply looked frightened. When the constables dragged me through the crowd toward the door, barely a handful of my audience were willing to meet my eye. They marched me the long way back to Imre, over Stonebridge and down the flat expanse of the Great Stone Road. All the way, the winter wind chilled the iron around my hands and feet until it burned and bit and froze my skin. The next morning, Sim arrived with Elxadal and matters slowly became clear. It had been months since I had called the name of the wind in Imre after Ambrose broke my lute. The masters had brought me up on charges of malfeasance and had me publicly whipped at the university. It had been so long ago that the lash marks on my back were nothing more than pale silver stars. I had thought the matter resolved. Apparently not. Since the incident had occurred in Imre, it fell under the jurisdiction of the Commonwealth courts. We live in a civilized age, and few places are more civilized than the university and its immediate environs. But parts of the Iron Law are left over from darker times. It had been 100 years since anyone had been burned for consortation or unnatural arts, but the laws were still there. The ink was faded, but the words were clear. Ambrose wasn't directly involved, of course. He was much too clever for that. This sort of trial was bad for the university's reputation. If Ambrose had brought this case against me, it would have infuriated the masters. They worked hard to protect the good name of the university in general and of the Arcanum in particular. So Ambrose was in no way connected with the charges. Instead, the case was brought before Imre's courts by a handful of Imre's influential nobles. Oh, certainly they knew Ambrose, but that wasn't incriminating. Ambrose knew everyone with power, blood, or money on either side of the river, after all. Thus was I brought up against the Iron Law. For the space of 6 days, it was a source of extraordinary irritation and anxiety to me. It disrupted my studies, brought my work in the fishery to a standstill, and drove the final nail into the coffin I used to bury my hopes of ever finding a local patron. What started as a terrifying experience quickly became a tedious process filled with pomp and ritual. More than 40 letters of testimony were read aloud, confirmed, and copied into the official records. There were days filled with nothing but long speeches, quotations from the Iron Law, points of procedure, formal modes of address, old men reading out of old books. I defended myself to the best of my ability, first in the Commonwealth Court, then in church courts as well. Arwyll and Elxadal spoke on my behalf, or rather they wrote letters, then read them aloud to the court. In the end, I was cleared of any wrongdoing. I thought I was vindicated. I thought I had won. But I was still terribly naive, in many ways. Chapter 46. Interlude. A Bit of Fiddle. Kvothe came slowly to his feet and gave a quick stretch.
Let's pause there for now, he said. I expect we'll see more than the usual number of people for lunch today. I need to check on the soup and get a few things ready.
He nodded to Chronicler.
You might want to do the same.
Chronicler remained seated.
Wait a minute, he said. This was your trial in Imre?
He looked down at the page, dismayed.
That's it.
That's it, Kvothe said. Not much to it, really.
Well, that's the first story I ever heard about you when I came to the university,
Chronicler protested.
How you learned Tamer in a day. How you spoke your entire defense in verse and they applauded afterward. How you...
A lot of nonsense, I expect, Quoth said dismissively as he walked back to the bar. You've got the bones of it. Chronicler looked down at the page. You seem to be giving it pretty short shrift. If you're desperate for the full account, you can find it elsewhere, Quoth said. Dozens of people saw the trial. There are already 2 full written accounts. I see no need to add a third. Chronicler was taken aback. You've already spoken to an historian about this? Quoth chuckled deep in his throat. You sound like a jilted lover. He began to bring out stacks of bowls and plates from beneath the bar. Rest assured, you're the first to get my story. You said there were written accounts, Chronicler said. Then his eyes widened. Are you telling me you've written a memoir? There was a strange note in the scribe's voice, something almost like hunger. Quoth frowned. No, not really. He gave a gusty sigh. I started something of the sort, but I gave it up as a bad idea. You wrote all the way to your trial in Imre, Chronicler said, looking at the paper in front of him. Only then did he realize he was still holding his pen poised above the page. He began to unscrew and clean the brass nib of the pen on a cloth with an air of vast irritation. If you already had all this written down, you could have saved me cramping my hand for the last day and a half. Quoth's forehead creased in confusion. What? Chronicler rubbed the nib briskly with a cloth, every motion screaming with affronted dignity. I should have known, he said. It all fit together too smoothly. He glared up. Do you know how much this paper cost me? He made an angry gesture to the satchel that held the finished pages. Quoth simply stared at him for a moment, then laughed with sudden understanding. You misunderstand. I gave up the memoir after a day or so. I wrote a handful of pages, not even that. The irritation faded from Chronicler's face, leaving a sheepish expression. Oh. You are like a wounded lover, Quoth said, amused. Good Lord, calm yourself. My story is virginal. Yours are the first hands to touch it. He shook his head. There's something different about writing a story down. I don't seem to have the knack for it. It came out all wrong. I'd love to see what you wrote, Chronicler said, leaning forward in his chair, even if it's just a few pages. It was quite a while ago, Quoth said. I don't know if I remember where the pages are. They're up in your room, Reshi, Bast said brightly. On your desk. Quoth gave a deep sigh. I was trying to be gracious, Bast. The truth is, there's nothing on them worth showing to anyone. If I'd written anything worth reading, I would have kept writing it. He walked into the kitchen, and there were muted, bustling sounds from the back room. Good try, Bast said softly. But it's a lost cause. I've tried. Don't coach me, Chronicler said testily. I know how to get a story out of a person. There was more bumping from the back room, a splash of water, the sound of a door closing. Chronicler looked at Bast. Shouldn't you go and help him? Bast shrugged, lounging further back into his chair. After a moment, Quoth emerged from the back room carrying a cutting board and a bowl full of freshly scrubbed vegetables. I'm afraid I'm still confused, Chronicler said. How can there already be 2 written accounts if you never wrote it yourself or talked to an historian? Never been brought to trial, have you? Quoth said, amused. The Commonwealth courts keep painstaking records, and the Church is even more obsessive. If you have a desperate desire for the details, you can dig around in their deposition ledgers and act books, respectively. That might be the case, Chronicler said, but your account of the trial would be tedious, Quoth said. He finished paring the carrots and began to cut them. Endless formal speeches and readings from the Book of the Path. It was tedious to live through, and it would be tedious to repeat. He brushed the sliced carrots from the board into a nearby bowl. I've probably kept us at the university too long anyway, he said. We'll need the time for other things, things no one has ever seen or heard. Reshi, no!
Bast shouted in alarm, sitting bolt upright in his chair. His expression was plaintive as he pointed to the bar. Beets? Quoth looked down at the dark red root on the cutting board, as if surprised to see it there. Don't put beets in the soup, Reshi, Bast said. They're foul. A lot of people like beets, Bast, Quoth said, and they're healthful, good for the blood. I hate beets, Bast said piteously. Well, Quoth said calmly, since I'm finishing the soup, I get to pick what goes into it. Bast came to his feet and stomped toward the bar. I'll take care of it then, he said impatiently, making a shooing motion. You go and get some sausage and one of those veiny cheeses. He pushed Quoth toward the basement steps before storming into the kitchen, muttering. Soon there was the sound of rattling and thumping from the back room. Quoth looked over at Chronicler and gave a wide, lazy smile. People began to trickle into the Waystone Inn. They came in twos and threes, smelling of sweat and horses and freshly mown wheat. They laughed and talked and tracked chaff across the clean wooden floors. Chronicler did a brisk business. Folk sat leaning forward in their chairs, sometimes gesturing with their hands, sometimes speaking with slow deliberation. The scribe's face was impassive as his pen scratched across the page, occasionally darting back for ink. Bast and the man who called himself Coat worked together as a comfortable team. They served up soup and bread, apples, cheese and sausage, beer and ale and cool water from the pump up back. There was roasted mutton too, for those who wanted it, and fresh apple pie. Men and women smiled and relaxed, glad to be off their feet and sitting in the shade. The room was full of the gentle buzz of conversation, as folk gossiped with neighbors they had known their whole lives. Familiar insults, soft and harmless as butter, were traded back and forth, and friends had comfortable arguments about whose turn it was to buy the beer. But underneath it all, there was a tension in the room. A stranger would never have noticed it, but it was there, dark and silent as an undertow. No one spoke of taxes or armies or how they had begun to lock their doors at night. No one spoke of what had happened in the inn the night before. No one eyed the stretch of well-scrubbed wooden floor that didn't show a trace of blood. Instead, there were jokes and stories. A young wife kissed her husband, drawing whistles and hoots from the rest of the room. Old man Benton tried to lift up the hem of the widow Creel's skirt with his cane, cackling when she swatted him. A pair of little girls chased each other around the tables, shrieking and laughing, while everyone watched and smiled fond smiles. It helped a bit. It was all that you could do. The inn's door banged open. Old Cobb, Graham, and Jake trudged in out of the brilliant midday sunlight.
Hello, Coat!
Old Cobb called, looking around at the handful of people spread around the inn.
You've got a bit of a crowd in here today.
You missed the bigger part of it, Bast said. We were downright frantic for a while. Anything left for the stragglers?
Graham asked as he sank onto his stool. Before he could reply, a bull-shouldered man clattered an empty plate onto the bar and set a fork down gently beside it.
That
He said in a booming voice.
was a damn fine pie.
A thin woman with a pinched face stood next to him.
Don't you cuss, Elias, she said sharply. There's no call for that.
Oh, honey,
The big man said.
don't get yourself in a twat. Damn fine is a kind of apple, innit?
He grinned around at the folk sitting at the bar.
Sort of foreign apple from off an outdoor. They named it after Baron Damfine, if I remember correct.
Graham grinned back at him.
I think I heard that.
The woman glared at all of them. I got these from Benton's, the innkeeper said meekly.
Oh,
The big farmer said with a smile.
that's my mistake then.
He picked up a crumb of crust from the plate and chewed it speculatively.
I swear it was a damn fine pie for all that. Maybe the Bentons got them some damn fine apples and don't know it.
His wife sniffed, then saw Chronicler sitting idle at his table, and pulled her husband away. Old Cobb watched them go, shaking his head.
I don't know what that woman needs in her life to make her a little happy,
He said,
but I hope she finds it before she pecks old Eli bloody.
Jake and Graham made vague grumbles of agreement.
Nice to see folks filling up the place.
Old Cobb looked at the red-haired man behind the bar.
You're a fine cook, Coat, and you got the best beer in 20 Mile. All folk need is a bit of an excuse to stop by.
Old Cobb tapped the side of his nose speculatively.
You know,
he said to the innkeeper,
you should bring in a singer or something at nights. Even the Harrison boy can play a bit of his daddy's fiddle. I bet he'd be glad to come in for the price of a couple of drinks.
He looked around at the inn.
A little music is just what this place needs.
The innkeeper nodded. His expression was so easy and amiable it almost wasn't an expression at all. I expect you're right, Coat said. His voice was perfectly calm. It was a perfectly normal voice. It was colourless and clear as window glass. Old Cobb opened his mouth, but before he could say anything else, Bast rapped one knuckle hard on the bar.
Drinks?
He asked the men sitting at the bar.
I'm guessing you'd all like a little something before we bring you out a bite to eat?
They did, and Bast bustled around behind the bar, pulling beer into mugs and pressing them into waiting hands. After a slow moment, the innkeeper swung silently into motion alongside his assistant, heading into the kitchen to fetch soup, and bread with butter, and cheese, and apples. Chapter 47. Interlude. The Hempen Verse. Chronicler smiled as he made his way to the bar.
That's a solid hour's work, he said proudly as he took a seat. I don't suppose there's anything left in the kitchen for me.
Or any of that pie Eli mentioned?
Jake asked hopefully.
I want pie too,
Bast said, sitting next to Jake, nursing a drink of his own. The innkeeper smiled, wiping his hands on his apron. I think I might have remembered to set one by just in case you three came in later than the rest. Old Cobb rubbed his hands together.
Can't remember last time I had warm apple pie,
he said. The innkeeper went back into the kitchen. He pulled the pie from the oven, sliced it, and laid the pieces neatly onto plates. By the time he carried them out toward the tap room, he could hear raised voices in the other room.
It was to a demon, Jake,
Old Cobb was saying angrily.
I told you last night, and I'll tell you again 100 times, I'm not a one to change my mind like other folk change their socks.
He held up a finger.
He called up a demon, and it bit this fella and sucked out his juice like a plum. I heard it from a fella who knew a woman that seen it herself. That's why the constable and the deputies came and hauled him off. Meddling with dark forces is against the law over in Amory.
I still say folk just thought it was a demon,
Jake persisted.
You know how folk are.
I know folk,
Old Cobb scowled.
I've been around longer than you, Jacob, and I know my own story too.
There was a long moment of tense silence at the bar before Jake looked away.
I was just saying,
he muttered. The innkeeper slid a bowl of soup toward Chronicler. What's this then? The scribe gave the innkeeper a sly look.
Cobb's telling us about Quoth's trial in Imre,
he said, a hint of smugness in his voice. Don't you remember? He started the story last night, but only made it halfway through.
Now,
Cobb glared around as if daring them to interrupt.
It was a tight spot. Quoth knew if he was found guilty, they'd string him up and let him hang.
Cobb made a gesture to one side of his neck like he was holding a noose, tilting his head to the side.
But Quoth had read a great many books when he was at the university, and he knew himself a trick.
Old Cobb stopped to take a forkful of pie and closed his eyes for a moment as he chewed.
Oh, Lord and Lady,
he said to himself.
That's a proper pie. I swear it's better than my mum used to make. She always skin on the sugar.
He took another bite, a blissful expression spreading over his weathered face.
So Quoth knew a trick,
Chronicler prompted.
What? Oh!
Cobb seemed to remember himself.
Right. You see, there's 2 lines in the Book of the Path, and if you can read them out loud in the old tamer only priests know, then the iron law says you get treated like a priest. That means a Commonwealth judge can't do a damn thing to you. If you read those lines, your case has to be decided by the church courts.
Old Cobb took another bite of pie and chewed it slowly before swallowing.
Those 2 lines are called the hempen verse, because if you know them, you can keep yourself from getting strung up. The church courts can't hang a man, you see.
What other lines? Bast asked.
I dearly wish I knew,
Old Cobb said mournfully.
but I don't speak Tama. Quoth didn't know it himself, but he memorized the verse ahead of time. Then he pretended to read it, and the Commonwealth Court had to let him go. Quoth knew he had 2 days until a telling justice could make it all the way to Amory, so he set about learning Tama. He read books and practiced for a whole day and a whole night, and he was so powerful smart that at the end of his studying he could speak Tama better than most folk had been doing it their whole lives. Then on the 2nd day before the justice showed up, Quoth mixed himself a potion. It was made out of honey and a special stone you find in a snake's brain, and a plant that only grows at the bottom of the sea. When he drank the potion, it made his voice so sweet anyone who listened couldn't help but agree with anything he said. So, when the justice finally showed up, the whole trial only took 15 minutes.
Cobb said, chuckling.
Quoth gave a fine speech in perfect Tama. Everyone agreed with him, and they all went home.
And he lived happily ever after, the red-haired man said softly from behind the bar. Things were quiet at the bar. Outside, the air was dry and hot, full of dust and the smell of chaff. The sunlight was hard and as bright as a bar of gold. Inside the Waystone, it was dim and cool. The men had just finished the last slow bites of their pie, and there was still a little beer in their mugs. So they sat for a little while longer, slouching at the bar with the guilty air of men too proud to be properly lazy. I never much cared for Quoth stories myself, the innkeeper said matter-of-factly as he gathered up everyone's plates. Old Cobb looked up from his beer.
That's all?
The innkeeper shrugged. If I'm going to have a story with magic, I'd like it to have a proper wizard in it. Someone like Tabal the Great, or Sarafa, or the Chronicler. At the end of the bar, the scribe didn't choke or startle. He did pause for half a second, though, before lowering his spoon back into his second bowl of soup. The room went comfortably quiet again as the innkeeper gathered up the last of the empty plates and turned toward the kitchen.
Peace be with you.
But before he could get through the doorway, Graham spoke up.
The Chronicler, he said. I haven't ever heard of him.
The innkeeper turned back, surprised. You haven't? Graham shook his head. I'm sure you have, the innkeeper said. He carries around a great book, and whatever he writes down in that book comes true. He looked at all of them expectantly. Jake shook his head too. The innkeeper turned to the scribe at the end of the bar, who was keeping his attention on his food. You've heard of him, I'm sure, Coates said. They call him Lord of Stories, and if he learns one of your secrets, he can write whatever he wants about you in his book. He looked at the scribe. Haven't you ever heard of him? Chronicler dropped his eyes and shook his head. He dipped the crust of his bread in his soup and ate it without speaking. The innkeeper looked surprised. When I was growing up, I liked the Chronicler more than Taborlin or any of the rest. He's got a bit of fairy blood in him, and it's made him sharper than a normal man. He can see for 100 miles on a cloudy day and hear a whisper through a thick oak door. He can track a mouse through a forest on a moonless night. I've heard of him, Bast said eagerly. His sword is named Sheave, and the blade is made of a single piece of paper. It's as light as a feather, but so sharp that if he cuts you, you see the blood before you even feel it. The innkeeper nodded. And if he learns your name, he can write it on the blade of the sword and use it to kill you from 1,000 miles away. But he's got to write it in his own blood, Bast added. And there's only so much space on the sword. He's already written 17 names on it, so there's not that much room left. He used to be a member of the High King's Court in Modeg, Coates said.
but he fell in love with the High King's daughter. Graham and Old Cobb were nodding now. This was familiar territory. Coat continued. When Chronicler asked to marry her, the High King was angry, so he gave Chronicler a task to prove he was worthy. The innkeeper paused dramatically. Chronicler can only marry her if he finds something more precious than the princess and brings it back to the High King. Graham made an appreciative noise.
Oh, that's a pisser of a task. What's the man to do? You can't bring something back and say, here, this is worth more than your little girl.
The innkeeper gave a grave nod. So Chronicler wanders the world looking for ancient treasures and old magics, hoping to find something he can bring back to the king.
Why doesn't he just write about the king in his magic book?
Jake asked.
Why doesn't he write down, and then the king stop being a bastard and let us get married already?
Because he doesn't know any of the king's secrets, the innkeeper explained. And the High King of Modeg knows some magic and can protect himself. Most importantly, he knows Chronicler's weaknesses. He knows if you trick Chronicler into drinking ink, he has to do the next 3 favors you ask of him. And more important, he knows Chronicler can't control you if you have your name hidden away somewhere safe. The High King's name is written in a book of glass, hidden in a box of copper. And that box is locked away in a great iron chest where nobody can touch it. There was a moment's pause as everyone considered this. Then Old Cobb began nodding thoughtfully.
That last bit tickled my memory,
he said slowly.
I seem to remember a story about this chronicler fella going to look for a magic fruit. Whoever ate the fruit would suddenly know the names of all things, and he'd have powers like to boil in the grate.
The innkeeper rubbed his chin, nodding slowly. I think I heard that one too, he said. But it was a long time ago, and I can't say as I remember all the details.
Ah, well,
Old Cobb said as he drank the last of his beer and knocked down his mug.
Nothing to be ashamed of, Coat. Some folk are good at remembering and some ain't. You make a fine pie, but we all know who the storyteller is around here.
Old Cobb climbed stiffly down off his stool and motioned to Graham and Jake.
Come on then. We can walk together as far as Byer's place. I'll tell you two all about it. Now this chronicler, he's tall and pale and thin as a rail, with hair as black as ink.
The door of the Waystone Inn banged closed. What in God's name was that all about? Chronicler demanded. Quoth looked sideways at Chronicler. He smiled a small, sharp smile. How does it feel? He asked, knowing people out there are telling stories about you. They're not telling stories about me, Chronicler said. They're just a bunch of nonsense. Not nonsense, Quoth said, seeming a little bit offended. It might not be true, but that doesn't mean it's nonsense. He looked at Bast. I liked the paper sword. Bast beamed.
The king's task was a nice touch, Reshi. I don't know about the fairy blood, though.
Demon blood would have been too sinister, Quoth said. He needed a twist. At least I won't have to hear him tell it, Chronicler said sullenly, prodding a bit of potato with his spoon. Quoth looked up, then chuckled darkly. You don't understand, do you? A fresh story like that on a harvest day? They'll be at it like a child with a new toy. Old Cobb will talk about Chronicler to a dozen people while they're bucking hay and drinking water in the shade. Tonight at Shep's wake, folk from 10 towns will hear about the Lord of Stories. It will spread like a fire in a field. Chronicler looked back and forth between the two of them, his expression vaguely horrified. Why? It's a gift, Quoth said.
Hello.
You think I want this? Chronicler said incredulously. Fame? Not fame, Quoth said grimly. Perspective. You go rummaging around in other people's lives. You hear rumors and go digging for the painful truth between the lovely lies. You believe you have a right to these things, but you don't. He looked hard at the scribe. When someone tells you a piece of their life,
They're giving you a gift,
I am honored.
not granting you your due.
Words are of the highest.
Quoth wiped his hands on the clean linen cloth. I'm giving you my story with all the grubby truths intact, all my mistakes and idiocies laid out naked in a light. If I decide to pass over some small piece because it bores me, I'm well within my rights. I won't be goaded into changing my mind by some farmer's tale. I'm not an idiot. Chronicler looked down at his soup. It was a little heavy-handed, wasn't it? It was, Quoth said. Chronicler looked up with a sigh and gave a small, embarrassed smile. Well, you can't blame me for trying. I can, actually, Quoth said. But I believe I've made my point. And for what it's worth, I'm sorry for any trouble that might cause you. He gestured to the door and the departed farmers. I might have overreacted a bit. I've never responded well to manipulation. Quoth stepped out from behind the bar, heading to the table near the hearth. Come on now, both of you. The trial itself was tedious business. But it had important repercussions.
Go in.
Chapter 48. A significant absence. I went through the admissions lottery and was lucky enough to draw a late slot. I was glad for the extra time, as my trial had left me little opportunity to study for my exams. Still, I wasn't terribly worried. I had time to study and free access to the archives. What's more, for the first time since I'd come to the university, I wasn't a pauper. I had 13 talents in my purse. Even after I paid Devi the interest on her loan, I would easily have enough for tuition. Best of all, the long hours spent searching for the gram had taught me a great deal about the archives. While I might not know as much as an experienced scriv, I was familiar with many of her hidden corners and quiet secrets. So while I studied, I also allowed myself the freedom to do other reading while I prepared for admissions. I closed the book I'd been poring over, a well-written, comprehensive history of the Aturan Church. It was as useless as all the rest. Willem looked up as my book thumped shut. Nothing? He asked. Less than nothing, I said. The two of us were studying in one of the fourth-floor reading holes, much smaller than our customary place on the third floor, but given how close we were to admissions, we'd been lucky to find a private room at all. Why don't you let it go? Will suggested. You've been beating this Amir thing like a dead horse for what, 2 span? I nodded, not wanting to admit my research into the Amir had actually started long before our bet had taken us to puppet. And what have you found so far? Shelves of books, I said. Dozens of stories, mentions in 100 histories. He gave me a level look. And this wealth of information irritates you? No, I said. The lack of information troubles me. There isn't any solid information about the Amir in any of these books. None? Willem spoke skeptically. Oh, every historian in the last 300 years talks about them, I said. They speculate on how the Amir influenced the decline of the Empire. Philosophers talk about the ethical ramifications of their actions. I gestured to the books. That tells me what people think about the Amir. It doesn't tell me anything about the Amir themselves. Willem frowned at my stack of books. You can't all be historians and philosophers. There are stories too, I said. Early on, there are stories about the great wrongs they righted. Later, you get stories about the terrible things they did. An Amir in Renere kills a corrupt judge. Another in Junpui puts down a peasant uprising. A third in Melithi poisons half the town's nobility. And that isn't solid information? Willem asked. They're soft stories, I said. Second or third hand. 3/4 of them are simply hearsay. I can't find corroborating evidence for them anywhere. Why can't I find any mention of the corrupt judge in the church records? His name should be recorded in every case he tried. What was the date of this peasant uprising, and why can't I find it mentioned in any of the other histories? It was 300 years ago, Willem said reproachfully.
You can't expect all those little details to survive. I expect some of the little details to survive. You know how obsessive the Talians are about their records, I said. We have 1,000 years of court documents from 100 different cities squirreled away down in Sub 2, whole rooms full. I waved my hands dismissively. But fine, let's abandon the small details. There are huge questions I can't find any answers for. When was the Order Amir founded? How many Amir were there? Who paid them and how much? Where did that money come from? Where were they trained? How did they come to be part of the Talian Church? Filtemi Reis answered that, Willem said. They grew out of the tradition of the mendicant judges. I picked up a book at random and thumped it onto the table in front of him. Find me one bit of proof to support that theory. Find me one record that shows a mendicant judge being promoted into the ranks of the Amir. Show me one record of an Amir being employed by a court. Find me one church document that shows an Amir presiding over a case. I crossed my arms in front of my chest belligerently. Go on, I'll wait. Willem ignored the book. Maybe there weren't as many Amir as people assume. Perhaps there were only a few of them and their reputation grew out of their control. He gave me a pointed look. You should understand how that works. No, I said. This is a significant absence. Sometimes finding nothing can be finding something. You're starting to sound like Elodine, Willem said. I frowned at him but decided not to rise to the bait. No. Listen for a minute. Why would there be so little factual information about the Amir? There are only 3 possibilities. I held up 3 fingers to mark them off. 1, nothing was written down. I think we can safely discard that. They were too important to be entirely neglected by historians, clerks, and the obsessive documentation of the church. I tucked that figure away. 2, by an odd chance, copies of the books that do have this information have simply never made their way here to the archives. But that's ridiculous. It's impossible to think that over all the years, nothing on the subject has ended up in the largest library in the world. I folded down the 2nd finger. 3, I pointed with the remaining finger, someone has removed this information, altered it, or destroyed it. Willem frowned. Who would do that? Who indeed? I said. Who would benefit most from the destruction of the information of the Amir? I hesitated, letting the tension build. Who else but the Amir themselves? I had expected him to dismiss my idea, but he didn't. An interesting thought, Willem said. But why assume the Amir are behind it? It is much more sensible to think the church itself is responsible. Certainly the Talians would like nothing better than to quietly erase the Amir's atrocities. True, I admitted, but the church isn't very strong here in the Commonwealth, and these books come from all over the world. A Keldish historian wouldn't have any compunctions about writing a history of the Amir. A Keldish historian would have very little interest in writing the history of a heretic branch of a pagan church, Willem pointed out. Besides, how could a discredited handful of Amir do something the church itself could not achieve? I leaned forward. I think the Amir are far older than the Talian church, I said. During the time of the Aturan Empire, a great deal of their public strength was the church, but they were more than just a group of wandering justices. And what leads you to this belief? Will said. From his expression, I could see I was losing Willem's support rather than gaining it. A piece of ancient pottery, I thought. A story I heard from an old man in Tarbeen. I know it because of something the Chandrian let slip after they killed everyone I ever knew. I sighed and shook my head, knowing how crazy I would sound if I told the truth. That was why I scoured the archive. I needed some tangible evidence to support my theory, something that wouldn't make me a laughingstock. I found copies of the court documents from the time the Amir were denounced, I said. Do you know how many Amir they put on trial in Tarbeen? Will shrugged. I held up a single finger. 1. 1 Amir in all of Tarbeen. And the clerk writing the transcript of the trial made it clear the man they put on trial was a simpleton who didn't understand what was going on. I still saw doubt in Willem's face. Just think on it, I pleaded. The scraps I found suggest there were at least 3,000 Amir in the Empire before they were disbanded. 3,000 highly trained, heavily armed, wealthy men and women, absolutely devoted to the greater good. Then one day, the church denounces them, disbands their entire order, and confiscates their property. I snapped my fingers. And 3,000 deadly justice-obsessed fanatics just disappear? They roll over and decide to let someone else take care of the greater good for a while? No protest, no resistance, nothing? I gave him a hard look and shook my head firmly. No, that goes against human nature. Besides, I haven't found one record of a member of the Amir being brought before the church's justice. Not one. Is it so outrageous to think they might have decided to go underground, to continue their work in a more secret way? And, if that's reasonable, I continued before he could interrupt, doesn't it also make sense they might try to preserve their secrecy by carefully pruning histories over the last 300 years? There was a long pause. Willem didn't dismiss it out of hand. An interesting theory, he said slowly. But it leads me to one last question. He eyed me seriously. Have you been drinking? I slumped in my chair. No! He came to his feet. Then you should start. You've been spending too much time with all these books. You need to wash the dust from your brains. So, we went for a drink, but I still harbored my suspicions. I bounced the idea off Simon when I next had the chance. He accepted it more easily than Willem had, which isn't to say he believed me, just that he accepted the possibility. He said I should mention it to Lauren. I didn't. The blank-faced master archivist still made me nervous, and I avoided him at every opportunity for fear I might give him some excuse to ban me from the archive. The last thing I wanted to do was suggest his precious archives had been slowly pruned over the last 300 years. Chapter 49. The Ignorant Edema. I saw Elxadal raise a hand in greeting from across the courtyard.
Growth,
He smiled warmly.
the very fellow I was hoping to see. Could I borrow a moment of your time?
Of course, I said. While I liked Master Dahl, we hadn't had much contact together outside the lecture hall. Could I buy you a drink or a bite of lunch? I've been meaning to thank you more properly for speaking on my behalf at the trial, but I've been busy.
As have I, Dahl said. I've actually been meaning to talk to you for days, but time keeps getting away from me.
He looked around.
I wouldn't turn down a bit of lunch, but I should probably forego the drink. I have admissions to oversee in less than an hour.
We stepped into the White Hart. I'd barely even seen the inside of the place, as it was far too rich for the likes of me. Elxadal was recognizable in his dark master's robes, and the host fawned a bit as he led the two of us to a private table. Dahl seemed perfectly at his ease as he took a seat, but I was increasingly nervous. I couldn't imagine why the master sympathist would seek me out for a conversation.
What can I bring you?
Asked the tall, thin man as soon as we were in our chairs.
Drinks, a selection of cheeses. We have a delightful lemon trout as well.
The trout and cheeses would do nicely,
Dahl said. The host turned to me.
And yourself?
I'll try the trout as well, I said.
Wonderful,
he said, rubbing his hands together in anticipation.
And to drink?
Cider, I said.
Do you have any Fallows Red?
Dahl asked hesitantly.
We do, said the host. And it's a lovely year, too, if I do say so myself.
I'll have a cup,
Dahl said, glancing at me.
1 cup shouldn't alter my judgment too badly.
The host hurried away, leaving me alone at the table with Elxadal. It felt odd sitting across the table from him. I shifted nervously in my seat.
So, how are things with you?
Dahl asked conversationally. Passing fair, I said. It was a good term with the exception of... I made a gesture toward Imre. Dahl gave a humorless chuckle.
That was a brush with the old days, wasn't it? He shook his head.
consultation with demons, good lord.
The host returned with our drinks and left without a word. Master Dahl picked up his wide clay cup and held it in the air.
To not getting burned alive by superstitious folk,
he said. I smiled despite my discomfiture and raised my wooden mug. A fine tradition. We both drank, Dahl sighing appreciatively at the wine. Dahl looked at me across the table.
So, tell me,
he said.
Have you ever considered what you're going to do with yourself when you're done here? After you have your gilder, I mean.
I haven't thought of it that much, I admitted honestly. It seems such a long way off.
At the rate you're rising through the ranks, it might not be so long at that. Already a Raylar at... How old are you again?
17, I lied smoothly. I was sensitive about my age. Many students were nearly 20 before they enrolled in the university, let alone joined the Arcanum.
17,
Dahl mused softly.
It's so easy to forget that. You carry yourself so tall.
His eyes got a faraway look in them.
Lord and lady, I was a mess at 17. My studies, trying to sort out my place in the world. Women.
He shook his head slowly.
It gets better, you know. Give it 3 or 4 years and everything settles down a bit.
He raised his clay cup to me briefly before taking another drink.
Not that you seem to be having much trouble. Raylar at 17, quite a mark of distinction.
I flushed a bit, not knowing what to say. The host returned and began laying dishes on the table. A small board with an array of different sliced cheeses, a bowl with small toasted pieces of bread, a bowl of strawberry preserves, a bowl of blueberry jam, a small dish of shelled walnuts. Dahl picked up a small piece of bread and a slice of crumbling white cheese.
You're quite the sympathist, he said. There are any number of opportunities out there for a person as skilled as yourself.
I spread a bit of strawberry across a piece of cheese and toast, then put it into my mouth to give myself time to think. Was Dahl implying he wanted me to focus more on my study of sympathy? Was he implying he wanted to sponsor me to Elfie? Elodine had sponsored my elevation to Raylar, but I knew these things changed. Masters occasionally fought over particularly promising students. Mola, for example, had been a scriv before Arwyll stole her away into the Medica. I do enjoy my study of sympathy quite a bit, I said carefully.
That's abundantly clear, Dahl said with a smile. Some of your classmates wish you enjoyed it a little less. I can assure you of that.
He ate another piece of cheese, then continued.
That said, it is possible to overdo it. Didn't Teckham say too much study harms the student?
Ertram the Wiser, actually, I said. It had been in one of the books Master Lauren had set aside for Raylar to study this term.
It's true at any rate, he said. You might want to consider taking a term off to relax a bit. Travel a little, get some sun.
He took another drink.
It's not good to see one of the Ademaru without a tan.
I didn't know what to say to that. The thought of taking a holiday from the university had never occurred to me. Where would I possibly go? The host arrived with plates of fish, steaming and smelling of lemon and butter. For a while, both of us concentrated on our food. I was glad for an excuse not to talk. Why would Dahl compliment me on my studies, then encourage me to leave? After a while, Elxa Dahl gave a contented sigh and pushed back his plate.
Let me tell you a little story, he said. A story I like to call The Ignorant Edema.
I looked up at that, slowly chewing my mouthful of fish. I kept my expression carefully composed. He arched an eyebrow, as if waiting to see if I had anything to say. When I didn't, he continued.
Once there was a learned arcanist. He knew all of sympathy and sigildry and alchemy. He had 10 dozen names tucked neatly into his head, spoke 8 languages, and had exemplary penmanship. Really, the only thing that kept him from being a master was poor timing and a certain lack of social grace. Dahl took a sip of wine. So this fellow went chasing the wind for a while, hoping to find his fortune out in the wide world. And while he was on the road to Tinue, he came to a lake he needed to cross. Dahl smiled broadly. Luckily, there was an Edema boatman who offered to ferry him to the other side. The arcanist, seeing the trip would take several hours, tried to start a conversation. "What do you think," he asked the boatman, "about Teckham's theory of energy as an elemental substance rather than a material property?" The boatman replied he'd never thought on it at all. What's more, he had no plans to. "Surely your education included Teckham's theophany?" the arcanist asked. "I never had what you might call an education, Your Honor," the boatman said. "And I wouldn't know this Teckham of yours if he showed up selling needles to my wife." Curious, the arcanist asked a few questions, and the Edema admitted he didn't know who Feltemi Race was, or what a Gearwind did. The arcanist continued for a long hour, first out of curiosity, then with dismay. The final straw came when he discovered the boatman couldn't even read or write. "Really, sir," the arcanist said, appalled. "It is every man's job to improve himself. A man without the benefits of education is hardly more than an animal." Dahl grinned. Well, as you can guess, the conversation didn't go very far after that. They rowed for the next hour in a tense silence, but just as the far shore was coming into sight, a storm blew up. Waves started to lash the little boat, making the timbers creak and groan. The Edema took a hard look at the clouds and said, "It'll be true bad in 5 minutes, then somewhat worse afore it clears. This boat of mine won't hold together through it all. We're gonna have to swim the last little bit." And with this, the ferryman takes off his shirt and begins to tie it around his waist. "But I don't know how to swim," says the arcanist. Dahl drank off the last of his wine, turned the cup upside down, and set it firmly on the tabletop. There was a moment of expectant silence as he watched me, a vaguely self-satisfied expression on his face. "Not a bad story," I admitted. The bruised accent was a little over the top. Dahl bent at the waist in a quick, mocking bow. "I will take it under consideration," he said, then raised one finger and gave me a conspiratorial look. "Not only is my story designed to delight and entertain, but there is a kernel of truth hidden within, where only the cleverest student might find it." His expression turned mysterious. "All the truth in the world is held in stories, you know." Later that evening, I related the encounter to my friends while playing cards at Anchors.
"He's given you a hint, Bickwits,"
Manet said irritably. The cards had been against us all night, and we were 5 hands behind.
"You just refuse to hear it."
"He's hinting I should leave off studying sympathy for a term?" I asked.
"No,"
Manet snapped.
"he's telling you what I've told you twice already. You're a king-high idiot if you go through admissions this term."
"What?" I asked. "Why?" Manet set his cards down with profound calm.
"Growth. You're a clever boy, but you have a world of trouble listening to things you don't want to hear."
He looked left, then right at Willem and Simon.
"Can you try telling him?"
"Take a term off," Willem said without looking up from his cards, then added, "Thickwit."
"You really have to," Sim said earnestly. "Everyone's still talking about the trial. It's all anyone is talking about."
"The trial?" I laughed. "That was more than a span ago. They're talking about how I was found completely innocent, exonerated in the eyes of the Iron Law and Merciful Tailor himself." Manet snorted loudly, lowering his cards.
"It would have been better if you'd been guilty in a quiet way, rather than be innocent so loud."
He looked at me.
"Do you know how long it's been since an arcanist was brought up on charges of consultation?"
"No," I admitted.
Neither do I, he said. Which means it's been a long, long while. You're innocent, lovely for you, but the trial has given the university a great shining black eye. It's reminded folk that while you might not deserve burning, some arcanists might. He shook his head. You can be certain the masters are uniformly wet-cap mad about that. Some students aren't too pleased either, Will added darkly. It isn't my fault there was a trial, I protested, then backed up a bit. Not entirely. Ambrose stirred this up. He was backstage during the whole thing, laughing up his sleeve. Even so, Will said, Ambrose is sensible enough to avoid admissions this term. What? I asked, surprised. He's not going through admission. He is not, Willem said. He left for home 2 days ago. But there was nothing to connect him to the trial, I said. Why would he leave? Because the masters are not idiots, Manet said. The two of you have been snapping at each other like mad dogs since you first met. He tapped his lips thoughtfully, his expression full of exaggerated innocence. So that reminds me, whatever were you doing at the Golden Pony the night Ambrose's room caught fire? Playing cards, I said. Of course you were, Manet said, his tone thick with sarcasm. The two of you have been throwing rocks at each other for a full year, and one of them has finally hit the hornet's nest. The only sensible thing to do is run off to a safe distance and wait till the buzzing stops. Simon cleared his throat timidly. I hate to join the chorus, he said apologetically, but rumour has gotten round. You were seen having lunch with Sleet. He grimaced. And Faire told me she heard you were, courting Devi. You know that's not true about Devi, I said. I've just been visiting her in order to keep the peace. She was half an inch away from wanting to eat my liver for a while there, and I only had one conversation with Sleet. It was barely 15 minutes long.
King's honor, friend.
Devi? Manet exclaimed with dismay. Devi and Sleet, one expelled and the other the next best thing? He threw down his cards. Why would you be seen with those people? Why am I even being seen with you? Oh, come now. I looked back and forth between Will and Sim. Is that bad? Willem set down his cards. I predict, he said calmly, that if you go through admissions, you will receive a tuition of at least 35 talents. He looked back and forth between Sim and Manet. I will wager a full gold mark to this effect. Does anyone care to take my bet? Neither of them took him up on his offer. I felt a desperate sinking in my stomach. But this can't, I said. This... Sim put his cards down as well, the grim expression out of place on his friendly face. Quoth, he said formally. I am telling you 3 times. Take a term away. Eventually, I realized my friends were telling me the truth. Unfortunately, this left me entirely at loose ends. I had no exams to study for, and starting another project in the fishery would be nothing but foolishness. Even the thought of searching the archives for information on the Chandrian or the Amir had little appeal. I had searched so long and found so little. I toyed with the idea of searching elsewhere. There are other libraries, of course. Every noble house has at least a modest collection containing household accounts and histories of their lands and family. Most churches had extensive records going back hundreds of years, detailing trials, marriages, and dispositions. The same was true of any sizable city. The Amir couldn't have destroyed every trace of their existence. The research itself wouldn't be the hard part. The hard part would be gaining access to the libraries in the first place. I could hardly show up in Renerade dressed in rags and road dust asking to thumb through the palace archives. This was another instance in which a patron would have been invaluable. A patron could write me a letter of introduction that would open all manner of doors for me. What's more, with a patron's backing, I could make a decent living for myself as I traveled. Many small towns wouldn't even let you play at the local inn without a writ of patronage. The university had been the center of my life for a solid year. Now, confronted with the necessity of leaving, I was utterly at sea, with no idea
of what I could do with myself. Chapter 50.
And with this chapter, I stop for the moment and take my food break. I'm just preparing here a little bit of things out of the mailbox.
What can I do for you?
Sadly, there is no such thing.
Or the Alliance?
I guess my druid is needing a little bit more. Good. No, that's it. Okay. I take my break and I'm most likely back in an hour or two. So I stop the stream. See you later.